A Kiss is Just a Kiss, a Grandma Dotty Sweet Rom-Com, Book 1. By Melinda Curtis. Copyright 2023. All rights reserved. Prologue. Dorothy Summer loved all her grandchildren, but she took special pleasure in her youngest son's 5 girls. Those 5 girls were pistols, had been from birth. And Tim, her youngest and most challenging son, deserved a kick or 2, maybe 5, from karma. He really had been a most difficult child. She'd raised him in the era when Dr. Spock, the pediatric doctor, not the pointy-eared fellow, was the only one giving child-rearing advice. Dotty could have used Dr. Phil's help, if he'd been around. But those girls. There was Maggie, the youngest. Could a child be born with a love of black wardrobes, dark eye makeup, and army boots? From the moment she could walk, Maggie had followed her own path. She'd been a rebel searching for a cause. Why, one summer she ran away to follow a band on tour, only to return and lead a protest against the pollution emitted by summer coal mining, a company run by her father. Signs were waved and Tim was hit on the head. Maggie and several others wound up in jail. Today, Maggie was almost done with her veterinarian training. She still had a penchant for black wardrobes, but she was about to be married and wearing white, which was a shocker. Sweet Aubrey was the next youngest. Tim had once boasted Aubrey was his one angel. Surprise! That angel had taken her high school graduation money and hopped on a ship intent upon saving the whales. She'd returned a year later, older, wiser, and with pits as smelly as a homeless person in a heat wave. Dotty should know, she used to volunteer at a soup kitchen downtown. Thankfully, Aubrey's sisters were able to convince her that shaving and deodorant weren't the evil plan of the establishment. These days, when Aubrey, a botanist working for Bon Bon Chocolate, walked into the room, she smelled of bonbons, not B.O. Now, the twins, Lily and Violet, were born chatterboxes. One time, Tim and the twins had driven Dotty to see her sister in Georgia, and the girls had talked nonstop the entire trip. Their gift of gab had tickled Dotty pink, but annoyed Tim until he was blue in the face. In their teens, the twins had developed a fondness for poetry slams, pivotal rap, and personal podcasts. Truthfully, Dotty wasn't entirely sure what a podcast was, and she'd never understood why their slamming events were always held at night and in a part of New York City Tim said was dangerous. To protect them, he tried to keep the twins at home, going so far as to install a security alarm on the door and windows in their room. To his surprise, they always managed to slip away. Today, Lily was a junior state congresswoman and Violet a college professor. It was still hard to get a word in edgewise when they were around. Any one of those girls could have been the leader of the pack, but it was Kitty, the oldest, who took charge. Kitty was the one who'd first recognized Maggie's independent spirit and dressed the toddler like a goth soldier. Kitty was the one who'd swiped Tim's home security codes and set the teenage twins free every night, along with paying for their bodyguard. Kitty was the one who'd convinced shy Aubrey to follow her heart and test her principles in the Antarctic. When Tim said no, the girls might just as well have been deaf. When Kitty said no, the girls stopped what they were doing. Why, take that summer after Maggie completed her freshman year in college. She'd walked into the living room at the family's beach house in the Hamptons and announced she was in love with a heavily tattooed underwear model. Said model reclined on a lounge chair by the pool in his skivvies. "You don't love him," Kitty had said in that steady way of hers, looking up from a medical textbook. "Not really. Not the way you should." "No," Maggie had replied with a good-natured smile. Kitty had smiled back, but there was a businesslike curve to her lips. "It's June. In July, we go to Tybee Island. For the annual family reunion. How does this underwear model feel about you?" "I don't know." Maggie blinked in wonder, as if the importance of his opinion hadn't crossed her mind. "And I don't know if he's worthy of an invitation to Tybee Island." Maggie's gaze drifted to the exhibitionist by the pool and then took inventory of her sisters. "He's just so beautiful. You think he'd be tempted with a kiss?" On the couch, the twins were arguing over the latest political scandal. In a high-back chair by the window, Aubrey was hunched over her laptop working on her thesis. They were all in college now, each girl beautiful in their own right. Dark-haired, petite Kitty was in med school, Aubrey and the twins, tall and willowy, were doing postgraduate work, and sturdy Maggie was still floundering through her general education courses, trying to decide what to do with her life. "All men are tempted," Kitty had murmured with a glance toward their father sitting near the fireplace. He was texting someone while wearing his philandering smile, the one that put a crease in Kitty's forehead. "All men are tempted. And all men fall." Her words sounded calculated. No one would look at Kitty and see calculation. At first meet, she appeared to be the kind of woman everyone would call friend, soft-spoken, a gentle beauty that didn't intimidate, and a way of looking at a person that made you think you were understood. Oh, her warm, dark brown eyes could seem distant when she was deep in thought. And when that was the case, if you asked her a question you might receive a distant reply. Kitty had a long memory. She remembered when someone disappointed her, as her father had done on repeated occasions. But she was quick to admit when she was wrong, and she was open to forgiving when others confessed their mistakes. As for her place among her sisters, Maggie often lamented the fact that Kitty was the only one in the family who understood her. Lily was certain Kitty could get her out of any tangle, while Violet was convinced Kitty was the only sister capable of keeping a secret. Aubrey claimed Kitty was frighteningly brilliant. Certainly, those standardized tests they made children take nowadays proved that fact. And men? To their detriment, men seldom saw past Kitty's quiet beauty. And she let them. Of course, she dated, but never anyone seriously because she never let anyone get close. She had a 3-date limit. It upset Dotty that Kitty allowed men to undervalue her. Someday, Kitty would find a man she couldn't resist. Or maybe it'd be the other way around and a man would discover he couldn't live without Kitty. In either case, Dotty hoped Kitty would find love before she died. Which summer girl should be our temptress? Maggie had catalogued their sisters with an appraising eye. "Normally, I'd say you." Kitty grinned at Maggie. It had been her idea to vet young men who tried to get serious with a summer girl with the kissing test. She'd seen firsthand how their father's infidelity had broken their mother's spirit and her heart. Kitty didn't want any of her sisters to fall for a beau with a wandering eye. "I choose to let the cat out of the bag." Maggie leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Give it your best shot, Kitty." Dotty had witnessed this exchange from a corner of the living room, a yellow book of photographs in her lap. As the girls' only living grandmother, one who stayed with them part-time, Dotty was generally considered invisible. And sometimes she became lost in her own muddled memories and faded into the past. But she noted everything that was important. The conversation. The rebellion. The love between the sisters. And on that particular summer day, she witnessed the downfall of one overly tattooed underwear model, a man who didn't try to resist Kitty's offer of a poolside kiss. For all Maggie professed to be in love, she hadn't shed a tear that day. In fact, she and Kitty had laughed about it. That's how strong the bond of the summer sisters was. Or how strong it appeared to Dotty. But what did Dotty know? She was an old lady on the sidelines. And frankly, Dotty was becoming, well, Dotty. Elsewhere in the church, the choir was singing softly and incoming guests were talking loudly. But the only thing Kitty heard were Beck's insensitive words, "Make a lot of money off mags. Make a lot of money off mags." The phrase played over and over, as if her brain was caught in a loop. "To the groom!" A chorus of masculine voices echoed the sentiment. The sound of manly guffaws and backslapping was drowned out by the roar in Kitty's ears. The wedding was less than 30 minutes away. Beck was like a gator lurking in a deep swamp. Kitty should have drained the swamp long ago. Guilt began to pound at her temples. Once her OB/GYN residency began, she hadn't had time for sleep, much less time to watch over her sisters. She'd chosen herself and her goals over her family, and she told herself that was okay. She'd told herself that her job shepherding her sisters was done. She protected the girls through childhood from the neglect of an ill mother and a callous father. They were all adults now, and capable of making their own decisions. Besides, Maggie had seemed happy. That happiness was threatened by Beck revealing he valued money over love. Kitty should have vetted the groom before he ever thought about getting down on one knee. Guilt found a jackhammer and struck from temples to eye sockets. She had to make this right. Kitty didn't want Beck to marry Maggie. And she wasn't the kind of person who stood by in an emergency wringing her hands. Which meant Kitty had to stop Beck from marrying Maggie. Immediately. A skeleton key protruded from the lock of the vestibule door. Kitty closed the door and locked the men inside. And then she ran to the opposite side of the church to find Maggie. "Stop the wedding!" Kitty forced her dress through the doorway to the bride's vestibule like a green grape being squeezed out of its skin. The summer half of the wedding party, 11 other bridesmaids, her parents, Grandma Dotty, and the bride turned to stare disapprovingly at Kitty. Beck's sister was a bridesmaid. Her spray-on tan clashed with her mint green dress. She frowned. Kitty's father speared his fingers through the blonde highlights at his temples. He frowned. Standing as close together as their Scarlett O'Hara skirts allowed, Aubrey and the twins frowned. Maggie turned slowly in their mother's white satin and lace princess gown, frowning, of course. Everyone was frowning except Kitty's mother, who was on a heavy dose of anxiety meds, and Grandma Dotty, who smiled at Kitty as if she'd just said the cutest thing. But Dotty had been smiling like that for the past 3 years since she'd started down the road to dementia, the road with increasingly less frequent side trips to Saneville. "My sister, the Joker," Maggie said, but there were deep lines carved into the traditional makeup at her eyes as she tried to smile. Her rich brown hair was French braided to one side and fell in soft feminine ringlets over her delicate lace-covered shoulder. Delicate lace-covered shoulder. The Maggie Kitty had grown up with wouldn't be a delicate bride. She'd be loud and non-traditional. She'd rock a wedding dress with a corset waist, black ribbon rosettes, and a streak of pink in her hair. She wouldn't recreate their mother's wedding day. She wouldn't marry some high society, lowly principled scumbag. Kitty glanced at Beck's sister. "Can I talk to you alone, Maggie?" No, Dad charged toward Kitty. At 60, he should have had wrinkles and maybe a paunch. Instead, he kept himself toned with Botox and Boris, his personal trainer. He was more interested in keeping up appearances and keeping an eye out for his next lover than Maggie's happiness. "It's too late to back out now. We already took the bridal pictures." Failure lanced through Kitty's gut with all the ragged precision of a med student cutting his first cadaver. Stalling, Kitty squeezed herself and her wide skirt behind a stack of boxes that held purses, cell phones and mint green flip-flops for the beach-themed reception. A wedding should be a sacred joining of two hearts, where the groom loves, honors and respects and doesn't plan to swindle the bride. That love should allow the bride to be true to herself. Aubrey and the twins stopped frowning and blocked Dad's forward progress. True to herself, Kitty repeated, wondering when she'd last seen Maggie wear heavy eyeliner or army boots. "Beck is a great guy," Maggie said in a soft voice that sounded more like Aubrey's. I love him." "You don't," Kitty whispered, catching her sister's hesitation. "Not really." Maggie couldn't love Beck. If she did, she'd be wearing a different wedding dress, getting married in Vegas, and having her reception at a Marilyn Manson concert. But Maggie's gaze was flat, as if she'd taken one of Mom's Xanax pills. It drifted toward their father and her voice dropped to a whisper. "All the guests, we took pictures." Who was this woman inhabiting Maggie's body? Failure grew claws that raked Kitty's insides until her stomach quivered with ribbons of despair. It couldn't be too late. She couldn't be too late. That doesn't mean. Did he cheat on me? Maggie's gaze bounced back to Kitty with a flicker of life. Was he tempted? Tempted? Kitty's despair-ravaged insides sunk to her mint green painted toes. This wasn't an underwear model Maggie barely knew. This was the billionaire who'd supposedly won Maggie's heart and had been by her side for a year while she and their parents planned this mega wedding. No one spoke. Not even Dad. Everyone seemed to be waiting for Kitty's response. "I don't know," Kitty said slowly and at a socially acceptable volume, when what she really wanted to do was shout. "But Catherine." Her father made it past the sister barricade, clamped his fingers on Kitty's arm and tugged her toward the door. "Please wait outside, before you ruin Margaret's day." Kitty cast a glance back at Maggie, who looked as though she'd seen a ghost. The ghost of underwear model's past? Maggie? Catherine. Her father pushed Kitty into the hall and shut the door behind her. Kitty nearly sank to the red carpet, as off-kilter and shell-shocked as a woman unexpectedly transitioning to active labor. This was a disaster. She had less than 10 minutes to stop the wedding. And she could only think of one way to do it. The spectacle was about to begin: Beck O'Brien's wedding. Regardless of who he married, Beck had expected some pomp. He'd anticipated his bride would want a lavish ceremony. He was a New Yorker, born and raised. New York was the home of the debutante and the hub of high fashion. An uptown New Yorker's wedding was large, lavish, and luxurious. So he'd smiled when the woman he'd chosen to be his bride wanted 12 attendants. He'd smiled when she wanted to be married in Boca Raton in the same church where her mother and grandmother had taken their vows. And he'd smiled when she wanted to take pictures for 2 hours this morning. Because his bride was great. She complimented him in every way: steady when he was volatile, kind when he forgot to be, and forgiving of his long hours. And soon, she'd be a vet. How perfect was that for a financial whiz who had a passion for horse breeding? His bride was as comfortable to him as Bingley, his golden retriever. Sure, she'd been snapping at him these past 2 weeks like an abused horse in a too-small pen. Sure, she'd been drinking too much leading up to the big day. And sure, she'd felt like a stranger in his arms this morning during their photo shoot. Chalk it up to nerves. Why should Beck worry? Everything was going his way. Beck was having a great year. The market was up. His colt O'Brien's free ride had come in third at the Kentucky Derby. He had 2 horses with riders in the dressage Olympic training program. He was engaged to be married. And his soon-to-be father-in-law was giving him a filly as a wedding gift, a horse with a pedigree tracing back to Man o' War. Life couldn't be better. Beck attributed the sweat at the back of his neck to the discovery 13 minutes before the wedding that he'd been locked in the groom's vestibule. But he'd been rescued. And now he was standing at the altar before 1,000 wedding guests, one of 13 men. 13. Beck's head pounded and his skin felt too tight, as if he'd been out in the Florida sun too long. Forget the family's multi-generational success on Wall Street. He was a horseman, from a long line of horsemen. And horsemen were a superstitious lot. 13 was an unlucky number. Seeing your bride before the ceremony was unlucky, too. And this morning, his horseshoe charm had disappeared off his key ring. If he'd been entering a horse in a race, he would have bet against him. But today, his wedding day, wasn't about superstitions or lucky charms. The long-awaited production that was his wedding was about to start. There was no time for second thoughts. Not that he had any. Not any at all. Beck tugged at his bow tie. The music began for the bridesmaid procession and the first bridesmaid appeared. It was Kitty. Like all bridesmaids, her dress was the color of a bright margarita, his favorite mixed drink. There was a sign. The wedding planner had insisted the bridesmaids needed full skirts to balance the massive girth of Maggie's dress. Getting within kissing distance of his bride for pictures this morning had been about as tricky as walking with Bingley after he'd been neutered and wore a plastic cone around his neck. Kitty was walking faster than they'd rehearsed, her steps out of sync with the music. She'd always stood out to him among her sisters, the shortest in height, the most delicate features, the darkest hair color, the most intense way of looking at a man. Of looking at him. As if he'd never measure up to her standards. Take now, for instance. She should have been smiling serenely. Instead, she glared at him as if he was a threat to national security. Apprehension galloped down his spine like an angry stallion defending his fence line. Had the sisters argued? Was his bride having second thoughts? Kitty ascended the altar and stopped in front of Beck. A wave of murmurs rippled through the church. She was supposed to take her place on the bottom of the altar on the far side, not a step below the groom. "Are you in love with my sister?" she demanded in a whisper, clenching her small pink peony bouquet with a white-knuckled grip. Something had happened. Something bad. Beck's smile wavered. What had Kitty asked? Something about love. Beck's balance wavered. Was he in love? His shoulder bumped his best man's as he struggled to find the words to answer. I am. Was that his voice? Did it waver, too? It had. He'd better not sound so unsure when it came time to say, I do. Unlucky. The day was unlucky. It couldn't end soon enough. Beck steadied himself. He worked up enough saliva to swallow and smiled, but it felt as if he'd borrowed someone else's lips. More bridesmaids were marching down the aisle, taking their places without glares or interrogations. Kitty didn't move. If your barn was on fire and you had to choose between that horse of yours and my sister, who would you save? You're saying she couldn't walk out? Beck blurted, immediately disliking his answer. He also didn't like that people were staring at them. And he especially didn't like Kitty. Move along, he growled. I love, his bride's name escaped him, damn it. Your sister. You don't. Kitty's eyes narrowed. Not really. Not the way you should. Something stuck in Beck's throat. Something sharp and shameful. Kitty was stuck, too. She didn't move. Not when the bridesmaids filed past. Not when the aisle was clear. Not when the organist began the first few chords of the wedding march. The guests stood. Beck had a bad feeling, a prickle at the back of his neck like the time O'Brien's free ride had pulled up lame last winter. This was the moment his bride had dreamed of her entire life. The moment Beck had patiently been preparing to endure. He tried to edge the short, wayward bridesmaid aside. And then disaster struck. Kitty kissed him. Chapter 2. Protecting her sisters had always involved drama, usually between Kitty and her father. It didn't usually involve a topsy-turvy, wish-I-could-turn-back-time, sickening sensation in Kitty's stomach. She sat on a curb in the near-empty parking lot of the church, melting in the waves of muggy Florida heat rising from the asphalt. Her poofy taffeta skirt floated about her in an unruly mint-green cloud that rose nearly as high as her face. Mission accomplished. Wedding stopped. Mom had cried. Dad had yelled. Maggie had disappeared in a swarm of mint green, bell-skirted bridesmaids before Kitty could talk to her. If only that was the end of the drama. Above her, dark storm clouds moved in from the east, threatening to blot out the sunshine. The guests had left, the bridal party had departed, and a few minutes ago, a priest had asked Kitty to vacate the church, locking the door behind her. She wished that was the end of it. If only those fast-approaching storm clouds would pass. Kitty couldn't get that lucky. Her mission may have been successful, but her job wasn't done. Her gaze stuck on Beck's truck, a large black beast with 4 tires in the back, 2 on each side. It was made for towing. Or perhaps mowing things down. The front grille was chromed and seemed to snarl, "My way or the highway." Staring at it made her stomach feel better. Waiting to take one last shot at ruining my life? Beck appeared next to her. His black tuxedo jacket hung over his arm. He'd rolled up the white sleeves of his dress shirt and untied his bow tie. He stood casually, but there was nothing casual about the expression in his sharp blue eyes as he glared at her. Those eyes made promises involving words like grudge and revenge. "I didn't set out to ruin your life." Kitty returned her stare to his truck. It had New York plates and road dust. No colorful streamers. No shaving cream letters that proclaimed the driver was happily just married. Was that a good sign? And if it was, good for whom? Beck stepped off the curb and onto the asphalt, blocking her view of his getaway vehicle. "You kissed me on my wedding day." He leaned over all that mint green taffeta, jaw thrust out, blue gaze grudgeworthy. "You had to know that kiss would wreck my life. I was more intent upon saving Maggie's. Saving her from a lackluster marriage, like the one their mother had." "That's how you save Maggie? By kissing me?" Beck set his lips in a thin, disapproving line, as if trying to contain the anger railing inside him. He failed. "I thought doctors were supposed to heal, not hurt." Kitty stared at her hands, unwilling to say more. She'd felt more than contempt when she'd kissed him. She'd felt an unwelcome spark. And in that moment on the altar, when the assembled had gasped and Maggie had wailed, Kitty had prayed. She'd prayed she hadn't made a mistake. She'd prayed for that errant spark to be nothing more than a product of nerves. She'd prayed Beck wouldn't kiss her back. "I thought the Summer sisters were close." Beck's harsh voice tried to rile. It couldn't. At least, not beyond the anger she already felt toward him for trying to use his sister as his own personal bank account. "I thought the Summer sisters cared about each other." Beck's harsh voice tried to wound. It couldn't. At least, not when she'd already beaten herself up about what had happened, not to mention that unexpected spark. Where had it come from? Kitty snuck a glance at him, unable to curb her curiosity about that glimmer of attraction, because one of her prayers had gone unanswered. Beck had kissed her back. Oh, sure. Beck was good-looking with his broad shoulders, wavy brown hair, and intense blue eyes. And he was intelligent, quick with a witty remark. But she'd dated smarter, wealthier, more handsome men without that feeling of chemistry. There had to be more to Beck O'Brien to have created that flush of magnetism. "I thought you, Maggie's idol, would never hurt her." Beck's harsh voice tried to demean. But, he faltered, his gaze turning distant. "You," he sighed and pointed behind her. "Isn't that your grandmother Dotty?" It couldn't be. She left with the others. Nonetheless, Kitty craned her neck to look. It was Grandma Dotty. She and Kitty shared the same petite frame and pert nose. But Dottie's hair was snow white and her skin the pale crepe of a pampered woman. She had her teal chiffon skirt lifted to her knobby knees and was dancing between 2 palm trees as if waltzing with Fred Astaire. Anger bubbled in Kitty's veins with heat rivaling that from the asphalt. It was one thing to leave Kitty at the church. It was another to leave Grandma Dotty. Kitty got to her feet in a tumble of taffeta. Beck was already crossing the lawn with a long stride Kitty could never hope to match, not when hampered by slender heels sinking into grass. "Ronald!" Dotty threw herself into Beck's arms. For the second time that day, the almost groom received an unwelcome kiss from a summer female. "Darling, I haven't seen you in ages." Beck backpedaled out of lip-lock range. Kitty kicked off her heels and ran barefoot the rest of the way across the crabgrass. Her grandmother shaded her faded brown eyes. "Is that Kitty? You look beautiful. What a gorgeous prom dress. And your date?" Dotty squinted at Beck, who backpedaled some more. "He's not my date." Nor was he Ronald, Kitty's deceased grandfather. Kitty placed her arm around Dotty's slight shoulders. She gave Beck a once-over. For the time being, he was no longer her future brother-in-law. The wind driving the storm clouds ever closer tossed a lock of Beck's hair over his forehead while he scowled. "We were at a wedding." "You should snap him up, Kitty," Dotty said in a loud whisper. "He looks like a keeper." "Looks can be deceiving." Kitty led Dotty toward the parking lot. Not only had she dropped the ball with Maggie, she hadn't realized her grandmother had come to a point where her mental stability threatened her safety. When they got back to New York, Kitty was taking Dotty to the best dementia doctor in the city. Meanwhile, there was a bigger issue at hand. "Beck, I need a favor." "Not on your life." His long strides carried him past them. Kitty drew Dotty along with more urgency. "I don't have my purse." Dotty sked. "A woman should never be without her purse. Which means I don't have my cell phone or money for a cab back to the hotel. That's why you should never be without your purse." Dotty sounded vindicated. Kitty refrained from pointing out that Dotty was purseless, too. Or that the doctors covering for her while she was away had no way to get in touch with Kitty in case they needed a consult. Beck stopped and turned, staring at Kitty with a smug smile. "Your family left you." Not a question, but a jab. A jab at Kitty. The impact of his punch rolled around Kitty's stomach like a fourth cup of coffee on the maternity ward night shift. She could tell herself 1,000 times that she'd stopped the wedding for Maggie's own good, but it wouldn't take away the hurt she'd seen on her sister's face. Did Maggie truly love Beck? Would she forgive Kitty? Did Kitty deserve to be forgiven? She had to get to the hotel to find out. Well, Kitty tried not to shrink away from Beck's stare, but found herself looking at Dotty's white orthopedic sandals outlined by crabgrass. They left Grandma Dotty, too. Priceless. Beck continued to stare at Kitty until she met his turbulent gaze again. "All right, I'll take you to the hotel. But only if you tell Maggie you lip-balmed me. I had nothing to do with that spectacle you made." "I love your spectacles." Dotty patted Kitty's arm. "They always upset Timothy. Have I ever told you what a trial he was as a boy?" "Many times." Kitty towed Dotty gently toward Beck's truck by way of her shoes on the lawn. "Listen, Beck. As long as we're bargaining, I'll tell Maggie the kiss was all me. She wouldn't mention he'd kissed her back. Just as soon as you tell her how you're only marrying her for her money." "What?" Beck threw his jacket to the grass and stepped closer to Kitty, angling his head as if to hear her better. The wind tousled his brown hair once more and a cloud began to block out the sun. But on this score, Kitty was as confident as she was delivering full-term babies. "Don't pretend to be innocent. I heard what you said in the vestibule before the wedding." She bent to put her shoes on, and then straightened her shoulders, her gaze, and her resolve, meeting his gaze levelly, if from a much lower height. You bragged to everyone about how Maggie was going to make you a lot of money. I bragged. Beck tossed his arms and turned in a tight circle. I said Mags. Mags is the filly your dad is giving me as a wedding gift. Nice try. Kitty narrowed her gaze. But my dad doesn't own a horse. Your Uncle Joseph does, Dotty said, sounding clearer than she had previously. Or he did. He took a pregnant mare in exchange for someone's debt and Tim bought her, earning the right to name the baby. Why can't I remember what Tim called that filly? Dotty's narrow features puckered with distaste. She knew she had memory and clarity issues, and she didn't like it. Margaret's renewal or Margaret's reindeer or Margaret's reward, Beck murmured, earning a scowl from Kitty, one he met with a shrug that seemed to acknowledge he wasn't comfortable with the filly's name either. She's black and the descendant of, Dotty stamped her sandal and demanded, of who? Man o' war, Beck supplied with a hint of a smirk. Mags was supposed to be a surprise, but Tim told me this morning while we were taking pictures. While Dotty muttered about memory loss, Kitty's stomach did an acid-spattering hokey-pokey. Her mind spun through the implications of the horse. Her father would never offer such a lavish gift, much less a gift exclusively for the groom. Unless you knew about the horse before my father had you sign a prenup. The smirk went the way of Beck's bride. Vanishing. Kitty's gut settled. At least one prayer was answered. She hadn't made a mistake when she stopped the wedding. You can't touch any of Maggie's fortune, but you do get the holy grail of breeders if you get married. How the loss of such a fine horse must sting. Beck clenched his jaw and glared at Kitty while proclaiming, I love Maggie. You couldn't remember her name at the altar, Kitty pointed out, clinging to that fact. Beck snatched up his jacket and marched across the parking lot. Kitty hurried after him, afraid he might leave without them. Was there a wedding? Dotty scrunched her white eyebrows together. I can't seem to remember. I envy you that, Dotty. Beck opened the passenger door to his truck and then walked around to the driver's side. I'm trying to forget. He started the truck and blasted the air conditioning. Kitty helped Dotty inside, balancing on the running board to buckle Grandma into the center seat, before lifting the cloud of taffeta and climbing in beside her. Kitty's dress needed its own seat. The mint green skirt filled the space meant for her feet and knees, and challenged the dashboard for height. Beck settled behind the wheel and began driving. He was an impulsive driver, speeding to red lights, braking hard, cursing under his breath. The sky continued to darken and Dotty couldn't keep her body upright as Beck squealed around each corner. She ricocheted back and forth between Kitty and Beck like a palm tree in a storm. The truck, devoid of decoration, bothered Kitty, especially when everyone else had flown down from New York. Why did you drive down here? We were going to honeymoon at your family's property on Tybee Island. I wanted to drive. He wove in and out of traffic. I like to drive. Something about Beck's answer didn't add up. He was a busy man. It took at least 2 days of hard driving to get from New York to Boca. It would have been more convenient to fly. And then the pieces fell together for Kitty, just as they did when she was diagnosing a patient with conflicting symptoms. My father's wedding gift couldn't have been a surprise. You wanted to pick up that precious horse of yours on your way home. Uncle Joe lived in Virginia. The horse was in Virginia. Virginia was on the way back to New York. Why else would you be driving this big truck? Her opinion of Beck lowered to the level of melted gum on hot asphalt. Dotty told me about the filly, Beck admitted, much of the bluster gone from his tone. A while back. Aha. He'd known of Dad's expensive carrot, maybe even before Dotty told him. For all his arguments to the contrary, Beck didn't love her sister. Everything was going to be all right. Maybe not today, but when Maggie had time to process why Beck had wanted to marry her, she'd realize Kitty was right to kiss him. Did I do something wrong? Dotty looked perplexed, leaning against Kitty as Beck took another hard left. No one ever listens to what I say. We always listen, Kitty consoled her. They just didn't always pay attention to the content of her words. And Beck raised his voice, apparently having decided his defense still had a leg to stand on. My grandfather always said a day without work is a lost opportunity. Dotty chuckled. All work and no play. Makes Beck a dull boy, Kitty deadpanned. A dull boy who was never marrying her sister. You would know about putting work before a personal life, wouldn't you, Dr. Summer? Beck's hands seemed twice the size of Kitty's. His fingers flexed on the steering wheel as he waited for a light to change. You were always working when Maggie and I tried to get together with you. You ignored her texts and sent her calls to voicemail. I can't take calls when I'm telling a pregnant woman to push. But the argument felt weak, crossing her lips, and guilt returned with a telltale pound at her temples. I bet Maggie won't take your call now. Beck pressed a button on the dashboard console, activating his cell phone. Call Maggie Summer. What are you doing? Kitty didn't want to talk to Maggie with Beck listening. She tried to reach the console to hang up, but Beck armbarred her, trapping Dotty against the seat, too. Kitty shouldn't have worried. Almost immediately, the call was forwarded to voicemail. I'm not taking calls right now. Maggie's words were tinged with teary anguish. Kitty's heart squeezed. And I don't want to see or talk to Beck O'Brien or Kitty Summer. Maggie choked on a sob. Not. Ever. Again. Maggie's voicemail beeped. Kitty's heart squirmed into her throat, muting her. Maggie, it's me. Beck. The harshness was gone. The sarcasm was gone. Beck sounded as if he cared. I've got your grandmother and Kitty. We're on our way to the hotel. We need to talk. He disconnected. No one said anything. Or maybe Kitty couldn't hear. She'd known Maggie was upset, but the pain in her voice, regrets rushed between Kitty's ears loud enough to drown out whatever insult Beck tossed her way. He was in the wrong. She could let regret overwhelm her, or she could be as catty as her namesake and take a swipe at Beck. Kitty released her claws. You didn't say you loved her. Beck spared Kitty a quick scowl. I only say those words to her in private. He was as unwilling to show public displays of affection as Kitty's father. Her cheating father, a man who didn't honor his wedding vows. Not one to miss an opportunity, Kitty smiled sweetly. I love you, Grandma. I love you, too, Dotty replied without hesitation. Beck ignored their dig. When we get to the hotel, you're going to apologize to Maggie and explain how you misunderstood what I said about Mags. It would help my case if you were high on something today. He hit Kitty with another dark look. Meth. Pot. Prescription drugs. I'm clean and sober. Kitty was reminded how much she hated Beck. I was in my right mind, and I was right. You are completely wrong for Maggie. He scoffed. How would you know? Because you're too much like her father. Ramrod posture, ramrod position, ramrod personality. White bread. Country club. And Maggie has always fallen for dangerous men. Rock stars, cage fighters, hockey players, the mafia. Dotty nodded sagely and swiped a hand in Kitty's direction when her granddaughter would have argued that last one. And yes, Tony was in the mob. I know a wise guy when I see one. I'm wise, Beck said straight-faced. And I'm dangerous. Because your nickname is Bet Me? Kitty refrained from rolling her eyes. That doesn't make you dangerous. But his kiss could be. And so could thoughts about kissing him. Do you think you're dangerous because you drive a big black truck? Grandma banked into the right turn, riding Beck's shoulder. Or because you have a scar on your wrist. Did you try to commit suicide? No, Beck scowled. I got kicked by a horse when I was a kid. Broke the skin and both bones. He held up his wrist so the women could see the thin horseshoe-like scar. Still not dangerous. Kitty spotted the hotel ahead. Her gut clenched. Dangerous would be if you were a Navy SEAL and you got that scar breaking out of a prison in North Korea. Jilted grooms don't count as dangerous. I agree. Dotty righted herself. Jilted grooms are, she patted Beck's leg. Well, they're rather pathetic. Chapter 3. What do you mean they checked out? Beck stared down the slight man standing before him. Beck had stared down angry investors, raging stallions, and just today one outraged almost father-in-law. He'd be damned if he couldn't stare down a hotel manager. To his credit, the hotel manager stood his ground, which happened to be in front of the main hotel doors. Despite the heat, he wore a buttoned-up maroon jacket and a bright yellow tie. The Summers have left for the airport, as have the O'Briens. Beck doubted that. The wedding party had over an hour head start on him. It'd be tight to get out of their wedding finery, pack, and check out. Granted, he didn't see any of the Summers' rental cars in the nearby valet lot. Although that might have been his father's rented Camry in the corner. Beck called his father, hoping to find him sympathetic to the situation or, at the very least, to discover Maggie's whereabouts. Kitty must have doubted the manager's words as well. Her wide skirt brushed the man as she glided past with her grandmother. Señorita. The manager scuttled around to block Kitty's entrance. He wasn't much taller than she was, but he outweighed her by at least 50 pounds. The O'Briens and Summers have all checked out. Not all the Summers. Kitty lifted her chin in the air. I haven't. And neither has my grandmother. Beck's call rolled to voicemail. Apparently, he was person non grata with both the Summers and the O'Briens. He was used to his parents putting him second. They were a unit unto themselves. Still, disappointment pinched his shoulder blades. Today, of all days, he needed someone to have his back. In front of Kitty, the hotel manager was standing firm. The other Summers took everything. Their rooms are being cleaned. Everything? From the room my grandmother and I shared with my sister? Kitty's voice dropped to a whisper and her eyes turned as big as a puppy's. She seemed to retreat inside herself, as if tears might be imminent. Beck was struck with the urgent need to comfort her. As was the hotel manager. I realize this comes as a surprise, he said, leaning toward Kitty and changing his tone from commanding to conciliatory. If I can do anything to help. Kitty nodded slowly, studying the man the same way she'd studied Beck in the truck on the way over. The same way she'd studied Beck when she'd been sitting on the curb at the church. In fact, it was the same way she'd studied Beck before she'd kissed him. Thunder grumbled a warning in the distance and the hair on the back of Beck's neck prickled. Kitty sniffed and readjusted her grip on her grandmother's arm, never losing that lost puppy look. I believe your hotel is liable for our things and fiscally responsible for returning us home safely. Beck did a mental head shake. Kitty hadn't been building up to a meltdown. She'd been analyzing the situation and thinking about her next move. And all the while, she'd been milking his sympathies. Sneaky. Beck had trained horses just like Kitty. 99% of the time they acted tame and did a writer's bidding. But then with little to no warning, they'd toss their head and take advantage, galloping headlong toward a brick wall in a deadly game of chicken until their rider bailed and the horse wheeled away. Some trainers found horses like that a lost cause. Beck considered them a challenge. The trick was to recognize the signs of rebellion and assert control before disaster struck. Not that Beck was going to waste time understanding Kitty. Since Maggie had left the premises, he was done with Kitty. He was going to find Maggie without her. We had assumed the manager stopped speaking, cleared his throat, and started again. Since everyone left in a hurry, we concluded that you were among the departing guests. And where did the departed go? Kitty blinked, still managing to look in need of care, when most likely she, like Beck, believed the hotel manager had been instructed not to let them in or tell them anything. Atlanta, Tybee Island, or New York? The hotel manager opened and closed his mouth like a fish, a scaly yellow-trimmed fellow trapped between the net of hotel obligations and his misplaced desire to help a woman, a shark, in need. They took my grandmother's meds. Kitty stroked Dottie's short silver hair. Without them? The hotel manager swallowed, but held firm. As if on cue, Dottie blinked, managing to look more out of touch with reality than usual. My pills are in the medicine cabinet at home. We can't fly to New York, Grandma. They took our purses with our credit cards and identification. Kitty managed to look innocent and sound non-threatening as she delivered the coup de grace. Which means we have no way of getting home without the hotel providing us with a car and driver. If Beck wasn't on to Kitty's con, he would have been concerned for Dottie. As far as he knew, she took no meds. The hotel manager wrung his hands. I believe they said Tybee Island. Props to Kitty. She'd gotten what Beck couldn't. Beck. Kitty turned those big dark brown eyes toward him before he could get away. You drove down here. Immobile, Beck nodded. He knew what was coming and braced himself to refuse. He had to get to the airport. To the plane. To Maggie. We need a ride to Atlanta. Those big brown eyes. Kitty had that woe is me act down. Beck felt a strong tug of compassion. He fought against it the same way he fought against a racehorse that wanted to run hell for leather out of the starting gate. Atlanta. Kitty added a wan smile to her assault. That's where Grandma was scheduled to go next, to visit with her sister. And then I'll need a ride to Tybee Island. Beck's head was moving from side to side, so it was surprising when he said, let's go. I might be able to catch Maggie at the airport. He hurried around the truck to the driver's side. If so, you can drive my truck back. With a soft wrinkle in her brow, Kitty pointed to the hotel lobby. But your things are inside. As, presumably, were his parents. He had no time to waste packing up or checking in with his folks. Beck hurried back around and pressed a business card in the hotel manager's hand. Send them to me. Kitty loaded her grandmother and the unlucky Margarita bridesmaid dress back in the truck. They'd try to fly the same airline they flew in on, wouldn't they? Beck tugged his phone out of his pocket and tossed it onto Kitty's big margarita-colored skirt. Use my phone and see when the next flight out is. You're not going to make it, Kitty said a short time later. It leaves in 30 minutes. They'll be through security by now. Fat raindrops hit the windshield. Beck gunned it onto the highway and tugged his wallet from his back pocket. Buy me a ticket. They arrived at the airport in the midst of a downpour with 10 minutes to spare. Kitty had been hoping they'd miss the flight completely. Even though Beck failed the kissing test, even though she'd stopped the wedding, even though Beck would never make the plane, Kitty's chest felt as hollow as it had the day she'd been unable to save a newborn. Beck parked at the departure curb. He grabbed his phone and leapt out, leaving his jacket over the headrest and his keys in the ignition. He was drenched before he reached the curb, yet he pressed on, his white shirt plastered to his muscled torso, his dark hair to his head. The emptiness in Kitty's chest expanded, filling her ears until it dulled the sound of the summer storm. That heart-sparking kiss. Maggie's wail at the head of the aisle. Maggie's refusal to talk to Kitty. The stupid horse named Mags. And Beck, she wouldn't have blamed him if he'd left them at the church. Or at the hotel. At the time, she'd been so certain she was doing the right thing. That boy has gumption. Grandma raised her voice to be heard over the relentless rain. We should wait to see if he misses his flight. Beck disappeared into the terminal, determined to reach Maggie before she took off. Thunder rolled. Rain came down so hard it bounced a good foot back into the air after hitting the ground. No planes would take off in this weather. Maggie's flight would be delayed. Beck's chances of getting on board increased. Kitty stared at Beck's credit card in the ashtray, the one he'd left so she and Grandma could get home. He was a gentleman, but she couldn't have made a mistake. And yet, the chest-hollowing, ear-clogging doubt persisted. Was it the filly Beck wanted? Or her sister? Kitty was 90% certain it was the filly. I said. Dotty turned her face to Kitty's and shouted, "He's not right for Maggie." Kitty checked her grandmother's face for signs that she needed medical treatment: dilated eyes, slack jaw, flushed face. Nothing about Dotty's beloved features signaled she'd gone over the deep end for medical reasons. Still, the family shouldn't have left you behind. Catherine Jo Summer. Grandma's eyes narrowed and she wrapped Kitty's hand. No one left me behind. You think I can't see? She shook as if her feathers had been ruffled. Beck O'Brien is no underwear model Maggie chose as a summer fling. This will take time to reweave the bonds of sisterly love. Kitty fell back against the door and took in her grandmother more completely. There was a spark of intelligence in her eyes and a determined set to her delicate chin. She looked sharper than she had in months. Dotty crossed her skinny arms over her skinny chest. I know I get lost in the past sometimes, but I try very hard to protect you girls. I always have, in my own way. Her chin came up. And today, someone needed to stand beside you, even if I had to hide in the ladies to do it. How sweet. The hollowness in Kitty's filled, at least partially. He's not right for Maggie. Dotty gave her a sideways glance, white eyebrows arched. I tried to tell her, I think. She covered her mouth with her fingertips, gaze growing distant. And then she waved her hand, waving her self-doubts aside. Anyway, I don't like the way your prom date looks at you. Beck is harmless. Those dark glares held no threat of violence. But he is guilty of using Maggie for his pound of horseflesh. Just don't ask me to prove it. He stares at you like Ronald used to stare at me, Dotty went on as if Kitty hadn't spoken, a wistful note in her voice. Before we were married. Kitty's breath caught, just for a moment, and her heart wondered. But it was only one fleeting, selfish moment, before her loyalties returned. Grandma couldn't be right about the type of glances Beck was throwing her way. That was anger, not passion. Regardless, he says he loves Maggie. Men intellectualize everything. Most don't know squat about love. Grandma pointed to a poncho-wearing traffic cop heading their way and blowing a whistle. We've got to move. Before Kitty could protest, her grandmother had unbuckled her seatbelt and slid behind the wheel. She stretched her short leg toward the pedals. No, Kitty tried to free herself, but the taffeta was bunched at her hips, burying the buckle. Grandma put the truck in gear and stretched her foot toward the accelerator, punching it. They fishtailed. Stop. Slow down. Pull over. That's what Kitty should have said. Instead, she screamed. The downpour became a typhoon. Kitty couldn't see out the windshield. Quiet down, Grandma continued driving blindly, trying to keep her eyes above the steering wheel and her foot on the gas, and not doing a good job of either. Obviously, you don't remember riding with your grandfather. I was always the better driver. They bumped into something, not hard enough to set off the airbags, but hard enough to stop the truck and make the engine hiccup. Did you hear that? Kitty asked. But who could be certain of anything over the incessant rain? Dang fool. Grandma put the truck in reverse, backed up, and then shot forward again, surging around the obstacle in their path, a hotel shuttle bus. The cop said move it, she shouted as she drove past. Had Kitty thought Grandma was clear-headed? Not a chance. Pull over. And risk getting arrested? No way. Dotty merged into traffic with the same competitiveness Beck had shown. I watch TV. I know what happens to ladies in the slammer. Chapter 4. Beck was dripping wet, but buoyed by hope as he began his campaign to get to the front of the security line. He edged past a sunburned elderly couple carrying a shopping bag filled with stuffed alligators and pink flamingos. Excuse me. I'm trying to catch a flight with my fiancé. May I? He stepped in front of them without waiting for a response, then sidled past a harried-looking woman pushing a double stroller with 3 small children crammed inside. May I? Beck gestured toward the front of the line. I'm about to miss my flight. She pressed her lips together and nodded, not trying to hide her disapproval. After all, she'd managed to get 3 small children to the airport on time, presumably alone. He couldn't imagine Maggie accomplishing such a feat on their last date. She'd taken so long to get dressed they'd missed the beginning of the movie they wanted to see and ended up watching a slasher flick, which turned Beck's stomach, but which Maggie seemed to enjoy. Now, Kitty was rumored to be an on-time machine. Not surprising for a woman as driven as she was to succeed. And why was he thinking about Kitty? Leaving a wet trail in his wake, Beck groveled his way to the security screener with 8 minutes until takeoff. 20 feet away, people moved about freely. The uniformed woman before him had frizzy gray hair, the dark brown alligator skin of the overly tanned, and bright blue eyeshadow. She scanned his ticket on his phone using a small black reader. The machine beeped, but it didn't beep happily. It bonked. Beck's damp, clammy skin pebbled as hope abandoned him. You've been flagged for additional screening. The guardian of the X-ray machine waved to another security guard behind her. Beck put together a smile the way a soldier loaded his gun when he heard the enemy charging with grim determination. I'd like a rain check. You see, my fiancé is. This will only take a few minutes, sir. She sat up straighter on the stool, the blue eyeshadow nearly disappearing behind her wide, watchful eyes. He refused to give up. But my plane is about to leave with my fiancé. And without him. Step to the right, sir. The command in the security guard's tone was unmistakable. Excuse me. Beck's lips stuck on his dry teeth. He began to move toward the X-ray archway. I only have a few minutes. Stop right there. The woman flung out her arm to block him. Reginald. She said, Reginald the way Steve McGarrett said, Book M, Dano. Like Beck's fate was a done deal. Come with me, sir. Beck glanced up. Beck was tall. Reginald was taller. And about double Beck in girth. Reginald looked like he'd been cut from the Miami Dolphins' offensive line for being overweight. Beck cast one more glance at the crowd walking freely on the other side of security before Reginald led him away. Pull into the gas station before you kill someone. Kitty employed the authoritative tone she used with her patients when she needed them to push one more time. It worked. Grandma yanked the wheel, missing part of the driveway. They bumped over the curb and lurched to a stop in 2 empty spaces in front of the convenience store. Easy peasy. Dotty put the truck in park. Kitty snatched the key fob from the ignition with trembling fingers and freed herself from the safety belt. No more driving for you. Why not? Grandma's cheeks were flushed with life and her words flushed with indignation. I've driven a pace car at Daytona. I'm a good driver. You were a good driver. Don't treat me like I'm old and useless. Dotty slapped her palm over the steering wheel as if giving it a spanking. I just proved how well I can drive. You proved something, all right. Kitty leaned over and hugged her fiercely, incredibly relieved they were safe. This truck is too big for you. When she pulled back, her grandmother's stare had that distant, cloudy look once more. Where did your prom date go? Kitty sighed, missing her grandmother's clear-headedness. She took Beck's credit card. I'm going to get you a bottle of water. Hydration sometimes helped keep clear Dotty's head. And then we'll pick up your date? Yes. Because she held out hope that Beck hadn't made that flight. And then we'll get you to Atlanta. By the time they reached Tybee Island, Kitty would have decided if Beck truly loved Maggie. And hopefully Maggie would have decided if she truly loved Beck. Either way, Kitty hoped Mag could find it in her heart to forgive her. It took Kitty all of 3 minutes to leap out of the truck, run into the store, buy a bottle of water and return. She grimaced at the damaged front grille, which seemed to grimace back, and opened the driver's side door. Grandma? The rain soaked her. The truck was empty. Grandma Dotty was nowhere in sight. Add strip search to the list of experiences Beck never wanted to relive. It was a short list, and included a prostate exam and having his wedding sabotaged at the altar. On some level, he understood why he'd been treated like a terrorist. He'd been uncooperative and belligerent. But he'd been so close to reaching Maggie. To saving his marriage. To keeping the filly. Mental head thunk. It wasn't about the filly. Or at least, it shouldn't have been. It was hard to stay dedicated to reclaiming his bride when faced with obstacle after demoralizing obstacle. He stepped over a puddle-swamped crack in the sidewalk. So perhaps he'd earned a frisking, a strip search, and an interrogation. But couldn't they have told the ground crew to hold his plane? When they finally let him out, Maggie's flight was gone. As was his ride. Beck stood at the curb of departures and stared through the curtain of rain toward the sparse traffic coming into the terminal, his truck nowhere to be seen. Now what? Beck wasn't used to failure. He'd been running the family's financial concerns and the horse farm since his grandfather died right before he graduated from Harvard. He'd invested in startups and foreign markets. Smart opportunities that paid off. He'd taken risks with breeding practices because his parents had no interest in bloodlines and genetic traits. He'd followed his intuition and it had never led him astray. Was this punishment for wanting the filly? Karma attempting to reset the universe? Or just a streak of bad luck? Arrivals and pickups are downstairs, sir. Another security guard approached, ready to enforce another rule on this dreariest of days. You should go downstairs. Beck turned from the road and held up his hands, trying to look as cooperative as any drenched traveler who'd missed his flight. My ride is minutes away. With his luck? Not a chance. Kitty was probably already miles down Highway 95. A vehicle pulled up to the curb, drenching his backside with water. Beck cringed and turned. It was his truck. Dotty pushed the passenger door open. She looked as if she'd been dumped in a pool, which was fitting since Beck felt as if hope had been flooded out of him. Despite that, he was cheered to see them. Cheered to see my truck in one piece, he silently amended. Beck climbed in next to Dotty and closed the door. He slumped in his seat and didn't say anything for a few minutes. "Where've you been?" "Potty break," Kitty said tightly. "I got locked in the ladies." Dotty shivered, sounding dejected. "It could happen to anyone," Kitty said with what seemed to be forced cheer. She headed toward the highway. "Did you see Maggie?" I was stopped. Understatement of the day. He'd been stopped all right. First by a bridesmaid, then by a hotel manager, and finally by security. Apparently, purchasing a ticket last minute and showing up without checking luggage marks you as a flight risk. Beck stared out the window. I was detained and searched. Dotty trembled beside him. Her short white hair was slicked to her head. Did they find anything suspicious? Beck slanted the old lady an incredulous look. No. Grandma, drink your water. Kitty leaned forward to catch Beck's eye. She needs dry clothes. She wasn't the only one. Kitty was soaked. Her once voluminous skirt draped around her legs like a thick wet sleeping bag. Her makeup had been washed away, robbing her of that sophisticated war paint New York women wore. Only the sable braids coiled around her head had been tight enough to withstand Mother Nature. They have a gift shop at the hotel. You can get dry clothes there. Hopefully, the model of efficiency hotel manager hadn't packed Beck's clothes yet. Dotty shivered again. Kitty must have felt it, too, because she repeated, she needs dry clothes. Now. Okay, but this is the last stop before Tybee Island. Which was a hard day's drive from South Florida. Still, Kitty could drop her grandmother off in Atlanta after he made up with his bride. There's a souvenir shop ahead. Pull in. Kitty turned into the lot and parked facing the street. Why don't you park closer? They'd have a better chance of staying dry. There's a spot by the door. Oh. Kitty glanced over her shoulder with those too big, too innocent brown eyes. Someone just took it. No one likes to see the front of their car anyway, Dotty said in that Dotty way of hers. Bugs. Road kill. She flinched and gulped back whatever she'd be about to say. Beck wasn't sure, but Kitty might have elbowed her. Fine, he grumbled. Let's be quick about it. I have a marriage to save. By the time they got inside, Dotty's teeth were clacking together like fast-trotting horse hooves on pavement. Kitty grabbed a couple of beach towels and Beck enlisted the help of a store clerk to get them a changing room. Their rooms had half doors, so everyone could see their calves and the tops of their heads. Only the summer women were so short Beck couldn't see their heads at all. While Kitty helped Dotty remove her wet clothes, Beck slipped the store clerk a 50 and asked her to find Kitty the tackiest clothes in the store. If he was paying, he was choosing what Kitty would wear. Yeah, he was a little vindictive. 2 wet women's formal gowns landed in a heap on the dressing room floor. The clerk handed items to Kitty over the half door of the changing room, and then bent to drag their wet clothes away. Do you want to keep these? No, came the chorused response. The clerk staggered under the weight of wet wedding finery and left them in a carpeted corner. Meanwhile, Beck picked out a pair of navy board shorts and a green polo shirt and found an empty changing room. In no time, he was done. Miss? Kitty's voice snapped with annoyance. I'd like something else to wear. Of course, she would. That's all they had in your size. Beck dumped what was left of his ruined tuxedo on top of their dresses. Now I know you're kidding. Kitty's vocal snap evolved into a catty growl. You're telling me they only had a thong bikini in my size. We only carry beachwear, not underthings. The clerk was nothing if not loyal to the man who'd bribed her. She gave Beck a thumbs up. I'll take that thong, Dotty said, with her usual cheer. I've always wanted to try one. You can have my one piece. No. Dad would kill me. Kitty sighed. If I walk out of here wearing this thing and see something else in my size, there will be blood. Do your worst. Beck smiled for the first time since she'd kissed him. Be glad that I'm offering to pay for a bathing suit and board shorts. A diminutive Asian woman near the front of the store opened an umbrella, flapping the metal tines in and out, which scraped like claws against the window. Beck looked away. It was bad luck to open an umbrella inside. He needed some positive signs. A horseshoe facing the right way. A penny facing up. His bride returning to him with a forgiving smile. Kitty stepped out of the dressing room and glared at him. She wore white board shorts with pink flamingos. Her t-shirt was white and read, I got flamingoed in Florida. The pink flamingo on her shirt raised a green margarita glass as if in toast. You. Kitty marched toward Beck, pink plastic flip-flops snapping. Dotty stood in the changing room doorway and struck a pose. We match. Trace chic. Kitty stopped in front of Beck. Her sisters had gotten all the height in the family, but none of them could match Kitty for chutzpah. This is payback for Maggie. She stood as close as she had been before she'd kissed him. He should have pushed her away and moved to the register. But there was something about Kitty that stopped him. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something that unsettled him and calmed him and called to him all at the same time. Beck licked his dry lips and tried to sneer. News flash, Catherine. We will never be even. Are we playing a game? Dotty joined them. Her white hair was a short frizzy cloud. I prefer bridge. Kitty plucked a rhinestone-studded pink baseball cap off a rack and fitted it gently on her grandmother's head. To keep you dry. Beck is buying us sunglasses, too. How sweet of him. Dotty flashed Beck that absurdly endearing smile, the one that said she'd have a soft spot in her heart for him no matter what he did. Beck beamed at the sales clerk. We'll take 2 of those pink heart-shaped sunglasses. The cheap ones. There was no mistaking it. Kitty growled at him. Chapter 5. You're smokin' hot. Kitty stifled a groan. For the past hour, the conversation had been carried by her grandmother. She'd never heard Dotty talk so much. Which would have been fine except Dotty switched sanity tracks quicker than a man switched TV channels with his remote. It wore on Kitty's already frazzled nerves. And now, Grandma was flirting with Beck. Smokin' hot, Dotty repeated, pointing to the front of Beck's truck. Or not flirting. The rain was letting up. Steam rose from beneath the hood. Shoot. Kitty kept looking forward. She parked facing away from the souvenir shop so Beck wouldn't notice his mangled grill. She'd been hoping Grandma's fender bender hadn't resulted in any casualties besides the grill. Although... Kitty straightened. You could tell a lot about a man by his relationship to his vehicle. Or his cell phone. Or his mother. Kitty angled herself to better read Beck. That's odd. Beck peered at the gauges, as calm and courteous as he'd been to Dotty the past hour. The engine temperature is in the red. Take the next exit. Dotty pointed ahead. There's a dealership in West Palm Beach that'll fix anything. Kitty made a more careful study of their whereabouts. They were coming up to what looked like Auto Row, several car dealerships clustered together. She recognized a familiar blue and white sign. In the chaos of the day, she'd forgotten help was so close. Beck moved into the right lane. "How do you know about this place?" "My family has owned that chain of dealerships for 4 generations." Dottie's voice rang with pride, which might have been inappropriate considering she was the reason the truck needed repairs. "Which one?" Beck came dangerously close to running over a Mini Cooper, braking at the last minute. "Robertson?" Grandma did the bobblehead nod. "They're everywhere along the East Coast." Beck signaled to exit. "Why didn't I know you came from automobile royalty?" "I wonder." Kitty didn't pull the sarcasm punch. "Don't imply Maggie and I don't talk about important things." Beck took the curved exit at freeway speed, making Dottie flop against Kitty's shoulder. "Let me assure you, we talk about things that are important to us, mostly a shared interest in horses." Grandma Dotty snorted like a winded horse and pushed her pink heart-shaped sunglasses up her nose. "Your so-called romance is in worse shape than I thought. You're lucky I have a sense of humor." Beck's grin was a lopsided baring of teeth. "Let's hope someday we can look back on this day and laugh," Kitty muttered. "Here's hoping that someday is tomorrow." Beck cornered as if the big truck was a sports car, turned into the dealership with a squeal of tires, and parked beneath the service carport in front of several open and empty service bays. He leapt out as if the truck needed life support and he was a paramedic, running to the front bumper. And then he froze. Steam billowed from the hood like hot water from an angry geyser. Kitty suspected something else was about to blow. She held onto Dottie's arm, anchoring her in her center seat. Dottie blinked at Kitty primly. "Aren't we getting out?" "Wait." Kitty wanted Beck to have some alone time with that damaged grill. She wanted to drink in his reaction like a cup of I told you so tea. "What the?" Beck shot them with a blue laser glare. "How did this happen?" He hadn't shut his door, which was letting in the muggy Florida heat, but wasn't nearly as hot as Beck appeared to be. He returned to stand inside the door, giving them the evil eye. "Is that what you meant about being locked in the bathroom?" "I was locked in the gas station's ladies' room," Grandma said with squared shoulders and socialite aplomb. It was very disconcerting considering the smell of the commode. Before the bathroom incident, Kitty began, trying not to smile. She widened her eyes innocently. "There was this hotel shuttle." "Oh, that." Dottie scoffed. "He was a horrible driver and it was pouring." Kitty wrested control of the conversation. "Anne." Whack! Dottie slapped her hands together. Beck's jaw ticked sideways and his gaze collided with Kitty's. "You didn't see a shuttle bus?" "It was pouring," Kitty repeated, feeling the first stirrings of annoyance. It had been an accident, after all. "You didn't see a shuttle bus?" Beck made a strangled noise. "Or its brake lights?" Kitty refrained from rolling her eyes. "It was." He stopped when the policeman said to go. Grandma Dotty was nothing if not truthful. "How was I not supposed to hit him?" Beck's jaw dropped. Kitty couldn't contain her smile. This was where Beck would lose his cool and ditch them. Kitty would be vindicated if he left them stranded in Florida. And since he delivered them to the cradle of Grandma Dotty's family, they wouldn't be without resources to get to Tybee Island. "Can I help you?" The blue shirt and navy pants would have given the young man away as a mechanic if his greasy hands holding a greasy blue rag hadn't. His red and white name tag said Vic. Beck gave Kitty a look that said they'd discuss Grandma driving his precious truck later. "We have a problem." Beck pointed toward the hood. "If I had to guess, I'd say radiator." Vic puckered his mouth the way people did when they didn't want to deliver bad news. Here's the thing. We close early on Saturdays. And we're not open on Sundays. I can't help you. You can't, Grandma jerked back into her high society persona. Young man, do you know who I am? His glance catalogued the granny-granddaughter twinsies with their matching board shorts, pink flamingos and pink heart sunglasses. He shook his head. Kitty tossed her sunglasses on the dashboard. Grandma released the belt buckle and scooted across the seat toward the door. Vic? Is that your name? I'm Dorothy Robertson Summer and you will fix this vehicle ASAP. Vic didn't back down. As a South Florida resident, seeing the elderly throw a tantrum was probably nothing new to him. Nice to meet you, ma'am, but... With the agility of a cautious toddler on an unfamiliar jungle gym, Grandma climbed slowly off the seat, onto the running board, and then to the ground. She settled her pink hat on her white hair and pushed her sunglasses up her nose. Vic, I'm part owner of this dealership. My photograph hangs inside this building. Her words echoed into the empty service bays. Go, Grandma. Vic and Beck looked taken aback. It was worth saving Beck's truck to see her grandmother clear-headed and in control. Do not, Dotty was saying, propping her fists on her hips. I repeat, do not make me call my brother Winthrop. Oh. Dotty went from concrete to crazy so fast it made Kitty's head spin. Winthrop Robertson? Vic released a breath and actually smiled a little. Grandma. I see it's still hard to find good help. Dotty waved Kitty off. Yes, Winthrop Robertson. My brother. Your boss. Grandma. But Vic was quicker than Kitty and far less sensitive. Look, lady. Winthrop died, 2 years ago. Kitty scrambled out of the truck, put her arm around her grandmother and glared at Vic. She really is Winthrop's sister. She's just tired and forgot he was gone. Gone? Dotty blinked at her surroundings. As in dead gone? Apparently, said Beck, sans sensitivity. He turned to Vic. Don't you have someone who can take a look at my truck? I'll pay double. You will not. Dotty got her second wind. She shook off Kitty's arm and shook her finger at Vic. I want to speak to your manager. Sure. Vic shrugged and disappeared into a service bay. You need to get out of this heat. Kitty pointed toward the service manager's desk, which was housed behind a wall of glass and might be air-conditioned. Winthrop is dead? Dotty walked slowly toward the door. Kitty began to follow, but then heard Beck murmur, I love this truck. She whirled on him. It's not dead. And geez, Beck was supposed to love her sister, but he looked more morose over a little dent than he'd been over his bride running away. Beck stared at the diminishing steam and mangled chrome. This will take days to fix, and even then, it'll never be the same. I should rent a car. Not we. Something inside Kitty panged. A car? You wouldn't be able to pick up mags, she reminded him in a carefully neutral voice. His eyes returned to her with a heat that rivaled the day's temperature. You think I care about that filly more than my fiancé? Yes. In reality, she didn't know who or what he cared about, or how much. And that was the problem. She'd shirked her duty to her sisters, and now guilt tumbled in her stomach like storm surge hitting the shore. Kitty turned away. Her grandmother was wandering around the dealership unchaperoned, and sometimes it was best to leave a man to his thoughts. She caught up to Dotty inside. Grandma stared at a row of black and white pictures on the wall. That's me. She pointed to a row of women in bathing suits with sashes across their waists. She was the only one wearing a tiara. I won Miss Florida. My father drove me to New York for the Miss USA pageant, and that's where I met your grandfather. He was a pageant judge. She sighed and then stared at the martini-drinking flamingo on her shirt. I had it going on once, didn't I? More than once. Kitty rested her head on Dottie's shoulder. Vic approached with an older, heavier man wearing the same Navy mechanic's uniform. He introduced himself as the service manager. Are you the one claiming to be a Robertson? The man may have been older than Vic, but he wasn't much wiser or any better at customer service. Grandma drew herself up and pointed to a photo of her sitting on the hood of a race car wearing white coveralls and a grin as big as the moon. That's me, you fool. Can't you see the resemblance? Everyone peered at the photo, in which Grandma looked like she was barely old enough to drive. She'd been a babe back then, but she was just another old lady in Florida now. Kitty removed Grandma's heart-shaped sunglasses before facing the mechanics. I'm her granddaughter, Dr. Catherine Summer. Beck would probably argue they'd also lost their minds, too. My grandmother is a Robertson. We can call someone in the family if you like. Kitty flipped through her mental contact list. Uncle Lyle. Or my cousin Philippa or Creighton. She hoped she didn't have to deal with Creighton. We're taking my grandmother to Atlanta and we need reliable transportation. You'd be out of here quicker if you bought a new truck. Vic was apparently uber sensitive, not, and uber concerned for his fellow man, not. Especially if something other than the radiator needs to be replaced. A man in his 30s with the pert Robertson nose entered through a side door. He wore a white shirt, blue tie, diamond-crusted rings, and a salesman's smile. Great Aunt Dotty. He swept Grandma into a hug that knocked her pink hat off. Was there an accident? Are you okay? Grandma bent to pick up the pink ball cap, looking a little lost. Most likely, she didn't recognize her nephew now that he was a grown man. Creighton. Kitty stepped into her second cousin's arms for a brisk hug. He was her least favorite Robinson relative, but she'd take any family over Vic right now. I haven't seen you in 8 or 10 years. Not since I beat you at the family summer games in Tybee. And there it was. That triumphant grin that set Kitty's teeth on edge. His gaze flicked to her ensemble. Did you lose another bet in a boat race? We lost our luggage, Kitty said quickly before Creighton asked if she was on a bender. Did I miss you at the wedding today? Didn't go. Big sale. Dad and Philippa are in Detroit for a conference. I couldn't get away. Creighton turned his attention Beck's way, giving him a once-over. His smile broadened the way a car salesman's smile did when he saw desperation and dollar signs. I hear you've got transportation issues. We rear-ended a hotel shuttle bus, Beck said, suddenly inclusive of Kitty and Dottie. And we need to get to Tybee Island as soon as possible. If you've got a streamlined purchase process and a dually, I can buy a new truck. He was breaking off his love affair with his black beast? Kitty's life would be so much easier if Beck gave up on Maggie, too. But she had to admit, she'd be disappointed in him if he did. New truck. Pa-haw. Grandma waved that idea aside. Creighton will fix yours in a jiffy. Why, you're practically family. She turned faded, uncertain brown eyes to Kitty. Isn't he? He's as close to being in the family as a person can get, Kitty confirmed with a nod. Creighton tilted his head, considering Beck's truck. Can you give me a minute to discuss this with my service manager? Of course. Kitty drew Dottie toward the windows and a view of row upon row of new trucks, none of them the kind with dual wheels in the back. When Beck joined them, she whispered, I can't believe you just give up on your truck. How disloyal. Beck's eyes flashed back to vengeful mode. Don't go thinking I get rid of things at the first sign of trouble. It's just, it'll never be the same. The frame might be damaged. I need things in my life I can trust. That would never be Kitty. Good news! Creighton's voice was backslapping happy. His grin was just as slick. Give us until tomorrow morning and your truck will be as good as new. Drivable, Vic muttered with a shake of his head. See? Dotty beamed. Family always takes care of family. Always, Creighton agreed, with a dismissive nod to the service crew. Now, I'm afraid I can't offer you dinner tonight. My wife called earlier. She's having contractions. Not to worry, he said quickly at Kitty's sharp intake of breath. This is our fourth kid and I know I've got a few more hours until things get serious. Creighton knew nothing. Every pregnancy was different. Kitty refilled her lungs with air, ready to tell her cousin the well-being of his wife and child shouldn't come second to car sales, but Beck laid a hand on Kitty's shoulder not to hold her back or shut her up. His touch was gentle, as if he knew she was upset by Creighton's callousness. You should be with your wife, Beck said, passing his palm across Kitty's shoulder blades and back again as if to comfort her. We understand. If we can trouble you for a loaner for the night and a recommendation for a hotel, we'll get out of your hair. A hotel by the beach, of course, Dotty said, allied. With room service. Wouldn't have it any other way, Beck said, smiling down at Kitty as if they weren't at odds with each other. As if he didn't regret their kiss. Chapter 6. Beck was no car thief. Nor was he heartless. More's the pity. He should abscond with the car and leave the summer women with their family in West Palm Beach. He'd seen Kitty bristle when Creighton talked. And she hadn't offered to let him go on to Tybee Island alone. She'd prefer he not leave them with the Robertsons. It shouldn't matter what Kitty preferred. But Beck couldn't leave them. He could call his parents many things, poor horsemen, poor businessmen, but they'd raised Beck to respect and protect women. So, he checked them into a hotel, took them to dinner at a Cuban restaurant on the beach, and listened to tales of Dotty's wild youth. But enough about me. Dotty looked at Kitty with the kind of pride Beck had always wanted to see in his parents' eyes. Kitty was the serious one. Keeping the family together even when the younger ones ran wild. She's been a particularly good influence on Maggie. From what he knew of Kitty, that fit. Maggie and her sisters idolized her. What didn't fit was Kitty's behavior today. So, Kitty never ran away from home? Or went to an all-night party? They shook their heads. They sat on a patio at the restaurant overlooking the boardwalk. A shade sail made the heat bearable. Beyond the bushes, the ocean rolled in on gentle waves. The dress code in the restaurant was casual and his companion's tacky pink flamingos didn't look out of place. My biggest rebellion was stepping away from the family and focusing on med school. Kitty cradled her sangria in both hands and stared into its depths. I made something of myself. Not much of a rebellion. Not much of a life either. Her history sounded like Beck's in the respect that he'd burned the candle at both ends to balance his passion and his obligations to family. The difference was that Beck hadn't neglected one for the other. That didn't mean he didn't think about it sometimes. But he couldn't let Kitty know that. So you never dated a dangerous man? Kitty rolled her big brown eyes and tossed her hair. She'd taken it down from the intricate braids. It rippled in the breeze coming off the ocean. Kitty doesn't have the patience for a dangerous man, Dotty said sagely. She barely has patience for men, period. You're making me sound like a nun, Kitty protested, slim brows arching. Too bad for Kitty, Dotty was clear as a bell this evening. You have a 3-date limit. That's not true. Who was your latest beau? Clark? Dotty leaned toward the center of the table, a sparkle in her eyes. Clark took you to a fundraising dinner you paid for, a Broadway matinee, and the Museum of Modern Art. Dotty shifted toward Beck and whispered, Momo was free to the public that day. Beck chuckled. Clark was definitely not dangerous. More like a miser. Kitty took a generous sip of sangria. And before that it was that man you used to work with. Dotty raised her faded brown eyes to the sky. What did Maggie call him? Dr. Hunky? His name is Hank. Pink rode high in Kitty's cheeks. Thoroughly enjoying himself, Beck prodded Dotty. How many dates did she have with Dr. Hunky? 3. The elderly woman practically sang the answer back to him. The breeze turned strong, tossing Dotty's short white hair every which way. Her eyes seemed to glaze over as she looked at Beck. Now, how many dates have you had with Kitty? Without thinking, Beck played along. This is my first. Don't. Kitty's voice was as cold as tack iron on a winter's morning. She touched her grandmother's arm. Are you ready to go back to the hotel? I'm sorry, Beck said, a sickening twist in his stomach. Everything twisted tighter when he saw there were tears in Kitty's eyes. That was inappropriate. What's inappropriate? Dotty stared at the margarita-drinking flamingo on Kitty's t-shirt. Am I your prom chaperone? Were you drinking? Kitty stood and hauled her grandmother to her feet. He's not my date. I never went to prom. And it's time we went back to the hotel. They didn't talk on the way back to their rooms. From the boardwalk, Beck watched the waves roll in and wreak havoc with the shoreline and the people there. His life had been hit by a powerful wave, too. And that wave was named Kitty. Growing up, she'd been overprotective of her siblings. And when she misunderstood his remarks about the filly, she'd leapt to her sister's defense. Could he blame her? Only for not confronting him about her suspicions then and there. A few minutes later, Beck entered his room and spotted the rental car keys on the hotel desk. Again, he was tempted to leave Kitty and Dotty. He should be racing to Maggie's side. He should be calling her parents and groveling. He shouldn't be sitting in a hotel room contemplating the value of the in-room cost of a small bottle of whiskey and wondering if the alcohol would silence the small voice in his head that whispered about bad luck and dodging a bullet. He hadn't dodged anything. He loved Maggie. She was steady and predictable. Or at least, she had been. Although their relationship had never been tested like this. He hated that he had doubts. He hated that he had doubts before Kitty had kissed him. A chair scraped on the outdoor patio his room shared with Kitty's. Anger rumbled through his veins like thundering hooves racing around the bend. By rights, he should have been married by now. He should have been blissfully happy with his continued good fortune. And he would have been. If not for Kitty's kiss. He opened the slider, immediately embraced by the lingering heat of the day and the noise from happy families near the pool. All the upstairs rooms were booked. Their rooms were on the ground floor and faced east, toward the ocean rolling to the beach 50 yards away. Kitty sat staring at the graying sky. She didn't look up when Beck pulled a beige metal chair to face hers and sat in it. My comment about Maggie can't have been the only reason you took action today. Beck kept his voice low in case Dotty was still awake. Were you jealous? Did you begrudge your baby sister the spotlight? She shook her head, still not looking at him. You aren't in love with her. The pork he'd had for dinner turned in his stomach. We could have talked your concerns through. You didn't have to kiss me. Her dark gaze sought his, asking a question he couldn't fathom. That kiss was an acid test. And you didn't pass. Unlike Maggie, she was infuriating in nearly every way. You kissed me. How could I not pass? Her gaze dropped to his mouth and then back to the sky. You kissed me back. The anger he'd been feeling toward her reared and changed directions, racing inward. He was guilty. He had returned her kiss. He stared at his hands, clenching them against rising doubt. It was a reflexive response. It was more than a reflex. She refused to look at him. It went on. It had. For too long. He'd avoided thinking about their kiss in detail because he was afraid of what that meant. He'd thought he loved Maggie. Until today. If what he'd felt for Maggie hadn't been strong enough for marriage, what was? His thoughts spun in circles that made him dizzy. He needed a distraction, so he went on the attack, letting all his messy emotions spill out. You ruined my wedding. You ruined my truck. You ruined my breeding plan. He sounded pathetic. Most likely because he was. He'd told Maggie he loved her. He'd asked her to marry him. Why hadn't he booked the next plane out today after being freed from security? Why hadn't he rented a vehicle to keep on driving? It was just, Kitty was just. He couldn't blame his hesitation on her. He hadn't followed his intuition. He'd followed the opportunity for the filly. He'd been searching for a good mare with solid racing heritage. But they all came at too high a cost. When he met Tim Summer, he'd been searching for someone to buy a share of the farm. A small share, but a share nonetheless. He'd lied to Kitty when he said he'd found out about the filly weeks ago from Dotty. He'd been in negotiations with Tim to buy the filly and had been for over a year. He stared at Kitty anyway. At the thick dark hair that fell in silken ripples down her back. At the petite profile that hid a deep well of strength. It had taken guts to stand up on that altar and kiss him. She sighed and faced him. Her expression didn't accuse or deride. She hadn't attacked his claims of love so much as denied the depth of those claims. And how could he blame her for finding a weakness he hadn't recognized within himself until now? Apparently, I ruined all but one thing. Her voice was soft, not damning. Her gaze was pitying, not pious. I didn't break your heart. The sounds around Beck went on mute. Time slowed. It felt like his heart slowed, too. But it slowed from the blood-numbing impact of truth, not from a mortal wound to the heart. He'd had his heart broken as a child. He knew what heartbreak felt like. He never wanted to be heartbroken again. Do your parents love each other? Beck asked when he could work up enough saliva to speak. No, Kitty's answer came too quickly. Not like they should. My father. I know about your father. About his philandering and his ill wife. But he didn't think Kitty knew about his parents. My mom and dad are in love with each other. That created a crease between her brows. You say that as if it's a bad thing. Grandma Dotty and Grandpa Ronald were head over heels in love with each other. It was beautiful. The crease disappeared. She drew herself up with a swell of hearts and flowers that bloomed into a smile. He should leave her with her happiness. He couldn't. Whether he liked it or not, he and Kitty had a connection. He needed her to understand why he was comfortable loving Maggie within limits. My parents love each other to the exclusion of everyone and everything else. When my grandfather fell ill, they were at a loss as to how to deal with him. When they should have been taking over the reins of the family fortune and the horse farm after he died, they barely paid the bills on time. She angled her chair to face him, hearts and flowers disappearing. My parents are crazy in love with each other. Gone was the volume control on his voice. He spoke loud enough to wake Dotty and reach passers-by. He didn't care. My parents have been in love since the moment they met. Their love is priority one. Everything else, everyone else, including him, comes second. That can't be true. Kitty's voice was wrinkled with disbelief. They love you. They were at the wedding. Maybe so, but they didn't stick around afterward to see if I was okay. And they haven't answered my calls since. He tried them again before dinner. Their world doesn't revolve around me, and it never has. That time I was kicked in the wrist? Grandpa took me to the hospital. They never showed up. She covered one of his hands with one of hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. He pulled his hand free. I'm not looking for sympathy for a lonely childhood. My grandfather made up for it. He'd come to open houses and soccer games. He'd helped Beck with his homework. He taught him about financial markets and horse racing. But after he died, my parents were content to let everything go. Everything my grandfather worked for, everything he was passionate about and sacrificed for. Everything that was important to you, she guessed, capturing his hand again for another heartfelt squeeze. He didn't pull away this time. She had a great bedside manner. He had no doubt her medical practice would thrive. I don't want to repeat my parents' mistake and love someone to the exclusion of everything else. I love Maggie. Lightning didn't strike, so it must be true. But I can love her and still devote myself to my business. I bet you knew you wanted to run that horse farm from the time you could walk, Kitty said in a neutral voice. Beck nodded, wondering why he'd never told Maggie any of this. Would she care? Would she understand? Had she guessed? I bet that your grandfather and that farm replaced the void that should have been filled by your parents. I bet you chafe at the bit when you're behind a desk. Beck said nothing. Kitty drew back, taking her touch with her. I think I knew I wanted to be a doctor for as long as I can remember. My mom has seizures and anxiety attacks. I wanted to fix her, because my dad didn't seem to. Her voice trailed off. She gave Beck a wan smile. Anyway, Mom couldn't always watch out for us, not the way she would have if she'd been healthy. Oh, we had Grandma Dotty and nannies, but it wasn't the same. I wanted a mom like the other kids had. He had, too. You took care of them. Such a burden for one so young. He'd never heard any of her sisters complain that Kitty had been too bossy or that she was resentful of the responsibility. He'd never complained about taking over the horse farm. He'd never complained when he had to drop out of soccer or watched every penny to the point he didn't date or hang out with his friends. I took care of the girls until medical school and my residency consumed me. And look what happened. She pressed her lips together as if trying to hold back her words, but she wasn't successful in holding anything in. And look what happened. You slipped past me. Maggie changed. My mom recreated her wedding. And then I had no choice but to kiss you. Their gazes met. Held. Something in Beck's chest shifted. His heart beat harder. Anyway, it doesn't mean anything. She spoke too quickly, drawing back in her chair. All men stray. I resent that remark. Or resemble, as the case may be. You gave me no choice. She made a grumbling sound that he took as an expression of frustration. I meant, our kiss meant nothing to me. Bad liar that she was, she looked everywhere but at him. I'm not looking for something with you or anyone. I have to devote myself to my practice and, somehow, keep my eye on the girls. Something in her demeanor shifted, almost without him noticing. Something in her tone. Something in her defense of their kiss being meaningless. Hey. He touched her shoulder as impersonally as if he was pressing an elevator button. You don't believe in love, do you? Kitty hesitated too long before answering. Does it matter? You're afraid passionate love could hurt you somehow or that it isn't lucrative. Emphasis on lucrative, which is what had gotten them into trouble in the first place. Kitty gathered her hair into a loose ponytail. I've been so distracted lately, so caught up in my own goals, I didn't see there was no passion between you two until today. Her gaze pierced his. You haven't slept together. Beck rocked back in his seat. That's none of your business. I know my sister. Maggie's no slut, but she wouldn't let a little thing like a wedding ring stand between her and. Kitty gave him a half smile, one that was part worry and part regret. I don't want you to take this wrong, but you're hot. His masculine pride encouraged him to take it wrong. His sense of honor wouldn't let him. If Maggie was hot for you, well, Kitty's half smile faded. Without passion, what happens the next time someone lip bombs you and you kiss them back? That's called cheating, and it's not fair to Maggie. From now on, I'm going to keep other women at arm's length. Especially Kitty. Why can't you accept there are all kinds of love? I don't prefer the kind of love you're talking about. It's distracting. I have my family fortune to shepherd and a triple crown the win. Maybe you don't prefer true love, but Maggie deserves it, nonetheless. Kitty laced her fingers together as if in prayer. At the very least, she deserves to know what to expect from you. Why? Because you think she needs more than I can give? Because it's important to you? He shook his head and made a decision. I'm going to ask Maggie to forgive me and marry me. That's your right. She untangled her fingers and stood. Just make sure you profess your love honestly, because if she asks my opinion, I'm going to tell her. She moved toward her slider. She can't trust you to honor your vows. That's not true. Kitty. Beck captured her hand. It fit snug within the circle of his fingers. Their warmth melded, creating a link in support of everything Kitty was saying. And yet, Beck still denied it, because he believed he could deny temptation even if it came in a package as tempting as his fiancée's sister. What will you do if she takes me back? Kitty stared at their joined hands and swallowed. I'll live with her decision. Beck released her and vowed to live with it, too. Chapter 7. Is that street legal? Kitty pointed to Beck's truck the next morning. The grill was gone. Vic had worked a miracle, replacing the radiator, but the grill couldn't be repaired. The truck no longer smirked or grimaced. Its mouth hung open. The surprised expression was probably a more fitting reaction to their road trip. As long as there's a bumper, it's legal. Beck looked as if he'd rather shop for a new truck than drive his old one. He walked past Kitty without looking at her. Let's get going. He hadn't met Kitty's gaze all morning. Kitty was glad. She'd been unable to shake the memory of his hand clasping hers, of the way her heart squeezed when his fingers encompassed hers. It was one thing for Beck to be afraid of loving Maggie too deeply, and another thing to know Beck and Kitty shared chemistry. If Maggie took him back, would the spark of attraction between Kitty and Beck fade over time? Would Kitty ever stand next to him and not have her heart thump with longing? Would Beck find that chemistry with someone else and betray Maggie's love once more? Kitty almost wished she'd never kissed him. When they'd first begun to talk on the hotel veranda last night, she'd been hopeful their situation and her feelings would be straightened out. They'd solved nothing except to create a deeper understanding of their pasts and their outlook on love, and to put a knot of uncertainty in Kitty's chest. Could Maggie win a bigger share of Beck's heart? Could any woman? They drove in silence for hours. Grandma Dotty was worn out from the excitement of the previous day. She napped through the morning, alternating her head from Kitty's shoulder to Beck's. The highway north stretched out before them, miles of concrete, shopping malls, and ever rarer green belts. "I've always wanted to visit an alligator farm," Dotty said, without lifting her head from Kitty's shoulder. "Every man in my life considered them a tourist trap and swore I'd lose a hand to a gator." She gave Beck a considering look. "Have you ever been?" No, his voice, so long and used, came out in a deep rumbly growl. Dotty was unfazed by the grouch next to her. "What about you, Kitty?" "It doesn't matter," Beck said before Kitty could answer. "We aren't stopping." "But it said last chance to see gators in Florida," Dotty said, as if that was reason enough to stop. "And a gator farm is on my bucket list. You know, I'm closer to kicking the bucket nowadays." Kitty couldn't contain a grumble of her own. "Don't talk like that." "Well, I'm not getting any younger." Dotty sat upright and settled her pink ball cap more firmly on her head. "I lost Ronald. I lost Winthrop. Who's to say I won't be next?" Kitty thumped her forehead gently against the window and stared at her reflection in the side view mirror. The pink heart-shaped sunglasses were too big for her face, just like Beck's attitude toward love was too big for her to overcome. Nobody knows what the future holds. No more stops. Beck infused his voice with authority. He'd been cranky all morning, even before he'd seen his beloved truck. Was he unhappy with the way their conversation had ended last night? Did he wish he could love deeply? Or was Kitty the one who was wishing? For Maggie, of course. Kitty swallowed back a sound of disgust. A distraction was in order. "Beck, I bet your grandfather would have taken you to the gator farm if you wanted to go. I bet he had no boundaries on his love for you. I bet." "But out," Beck snapped. "Do I know Beck's grandfather?" Dotty shifted in her seat. "He sounds like a wonderful man. He died years ago." Beck sent a dark look Kitty's way. "And yes, he took me places he probably shouldn't have when I was a kid, like the racetrack and Wall Street. But everything we did together had a purpose." "Oh, come on," Kitty blurted. "You're saying he never took you to a museum or Central Park to fly a kite? He never let you just be a kid?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." He slowed to allow a semi-truck to pull into their lane. Stock reports, shareholder meetings, entrepreneurial pitch sessions. Horse races, horse shows, breeding conventions. "Don't knock it. I liked it." These last words were spoken with less conviction. "He taught me about business. He taught me about horses. He made me resilient. I can't tell you how many times I was thrown from a horse and he made me get right back on." Beck's quiet drive to succeed took on new meaning. Kitty imagined a toddler with tousled brown hair and a solemn expression dogging his grandfather's every step. A young boy with that same brown tousled mop sitting silently at a table of venerable businessmen. A clean-cut young man bent with grief, determined to make his grandfather proud. And always in the background, his parents, unwilling to encircle him with love. Kitty's heart ached for that him. But Dotty's face puckered. "During all those years when you were growing up, didn't you ever cut a rug? Borrow the family car for a joy ride? Escape with a pretty girl into the city? No." "Oh, Beck," Dotty scolded. "You need to go to the gator farm worse than I do." Beck wasn't buying it. Is that how you want your kids to be raised? Kitty had to know if her nieces and nephews would be groomed to take over Beck's family business or be allowed to be kids. He opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. The semi-truck in front of them got back into the right lane. Beck gunned past him. They approached another sign for gators. Gators! Gators! This time with big red letters that said, "Next exit." Dotty fidgeted. Coffee runs right through me. Cleans out my bagpipes, too. Beck made a sound like a trapped carnivore. They'd made 2 potty stops already. They probably have a bathroom at the gator farm. And a food booth, too. Dotty rested her hands on her knees and rocked back and forth. Maybe they have corn dogs. Or gator dogs, Kitty teased, unable to resist. That remark earned her a glare from Beck. Those signs you've been seeing aren't for a gator farm. His voice was as gruff as a pack-a-day smoker. They're for airboat tours through the swamp. Boats. Kitty's heart nearly stopped beating. Speed. Even better. Dotty clapped her hands like an excited toddler. Does that mean we can go? Beck sighed heavily. I'm not going to hear the end of gators if I don't take you, am I? Nope. Dotty popped the pea. She was either punch-drunk from being in the truck so long or she was drifting in reality. Kitty would have given her grandmother water if she hadn't been doing the strapped-in potty dance. This will be our last stop before Tybee Island. Beck changed lanes, sliding the big black beast between an old red Camry and a white Prius with little room to spare. He should have been a jockey. He was that good weaving in and out of high-speed traffic. The last stop, Beck repeated when Dotty didn't answer. Other than breaks to go to the ladies. Dotty held up 3 fingers. I swear. Kitty didn't think it was a good idea to tell Beck her grandmother had never been a Girl Scout. A short time later, the trio stood on a dock beneath a thatched roof waiting for an airboat to take them and about 30 other tourists on a boat ride. Kitty's stomach was set on the spin cycle. She didn't want to get on the boat. But she didn't want to let Dotty out of her sight, either. Since her grandfather's death, Dotty had a way of finding trouble. Do you think we'll see some action? Dotty was like a teenage boy at the X Games. She talked to anyone who'd listen to her, the ticket agent, other tourists, and now a preteen boy with a blonde mohawk and a golf ball-sized wad of chewing gum. If our driver gets too close and someone dangles some steak off the side, hooey. There could be blood. The preteen boy grinned around his braces. I don't have steak, but I have gummy worms. The two bantered about what bait they had in their pockets. Grandma had gator jerky and what kind of bait they wished for. Grandma favored sushi. And then they speculated on how large Big Al was. Big Al was advertised as being the largest alligator in Florida. 2 airboats raced around a mangrove island about a quarter-mile away. Both had a full load of tourists. An alligator swam out of their way, too small to be Big Al. Kitty stood very still, struggling to fill her lungs with air. The swamp smelled of rotting vegetation, like a pile of cut grass left out in the hot sun for days. You're sweating. Beck brushed a damp lock of hair away from her face. It's Florida. Kitty's voice sounded as if it belonged to a small and fearful bullfrog. And it's hot. Of course, I'd be sweating. Beck leaned down and peered into her eyes, blocking her view of the approaching boats. That looks like fear sweat. She pushed him back, raising her voice so he could hear her over the increasing whine of the engines. I don't like boats. They can flip and capsize, and she made herself look at him, trying to will away the panic that was making her hands shake. Best not waste words. I flipped a boat once. On the ocean. We thought she was dead. Dotty rejoined their conversation. Happened during a family trip to Tybee Island. She hit a rock, the boat flipped and sank. And all we could see from shore was her orange life vest floating in the water. Creighton said he didn't notice. The boat noise was louder now, vibrating into Kitty's ears. Undulating through her words along with the fear and the slow-motion memory of being thrown into the air, followed by the jarring thud of slamming into the water. We made a bet. We were racing and he didn't look back until his boat reached the buoy. That explains the frost you sent Creighton's way yesterday. Beck's eyes narrowed. If I ever see your cousin again, I'm going to have words with him. Beck was protective of her? Kitty drew in a deep breath. She wasn't used to being the protectee. Her body flushed with heat. She wanted to hug Beck, or at the very least give his hand an appreciative squeeze. Maggie reached her first on her jet ski. Dotty carried on the story. She framed Kitty's face in her hands and stared into her eyes with love, acting her age for a change. We were lucky that day. You bring so much love to our family. Kitty covered one of Dotty's hands with her own, thankful for the touch that kept her from reaching for Beck. I'd like to think there was a higher purpose in me walking away from the accident with no more than a mild case of whiplash, but I'm afraid it was more likely due to luck. Are you superstitious? Beck asked sharply. No more than you. Kitty tried to smile. But I don't like boats. I don't even take the Staten Island ferry. The big airboats had reached them, powered down their engines, and were turning slowly. The drivers tossed lines to workers on the dock, who secured them to metal cleats. The crowd inched forward, bunching up. Dotty moved with them, the eccentric grandmother once more. Fear pressed in on Kitty's temples and sent a trickle of sweat down her spine. I know fears are irrational, but they're my fears. I'm sure these boats don't go fast, Beck said just as a flushed-faced teenage boy jumped to the dock and shouted, that was faster than the roller coaster at Universal Studios. Can we go again? I'll sit this one out. Kitty dug in her flip-flopping heels. Watch out for my grandmother. Best way to beat a fear is to get back on a horse. Beck put his arm around Kitty, swept her closer, and toward the boat. His touch reassured, but not enough to erase her fear. This is not a teaching moment. Kitty's steps were stiff and reluctant. She searched for the exit, but there was none. There was no escape until they snaked out of the line near the boat entrance. Life is a teaching moment, Beck said as if he was the Dalai Lama spouting ideas for a new social media meme. If that's true, what did we learn from yesterday's events? Tell me one positive thing you learned, and I'll get on that boat. She felt a wash of relief. If silver linings came in big bugs that splattered on windshields, Beck wouldn't see one. I learned that I have to be honest with Maggie about my feelings. He was serious. No smile graced his handsome face. There wasn't a trace of sarcasm in his tone. And I was surprised to learn just how far someone will go to protect someone they love. He could have laid waste to Kitty and her actions. He could have made her feel foolish to a line full of strangers. He hadn't. Numb, Kitty moved forward with the crowd, reliving the painful body slap against the water, feeling her back cramp with muscle memory. You make it hard to hate you. Likewise, he said as they rounded the last snaking turn in line. He gave her a friendly smile, one that said despite everything, they'd forged a truce. The first boat was nearly full. Dotty and her Mohawk friend scrambled to the top seat with the driver of the second boat. Kitty seized Beck's hand. Don't let go. He didn't. They sat on a bench seat in front of Dotty. The boat swayed gently from passengers entering. The motion rocked at Kitty's composure. There was no breeze. In the hot sun, the humidity made it feel as if she was sitting beneath a thick blanket, suffocating. Kitty moved closer to Beck and kept her head down, which brought her gaze to the sprinkling of dark hair on Beck's tan legs. They were strong legs leading to strong feet. He was all lean muscle from working with horses. Quite the contrast to Dr. Hunky. Beck's torso shook. Kitty leaned back to peer at his face. "Are you laughing at me?" He nodded, a fitting accent to a gentle smile and a warm sparkle in his blue eyes. "I find it amusing that the mighty Dr. Kitty Summer has a weakness. It makes you human. And mortal." Kitty angled in her seat until their knees almost touched. He was very close. Kissably close. His lips could probably kiss the fear right out of her. "Get a grip, Kitty. He's Maggie's." She stopped looking at his lips, but her gaze was caught in his. She should move away, turn away, let him go. But as the boat pulled away from the dock, the memory of being helplessly flung in the air returned. Kitty clung to Beck's hand and whispered again, "Don't let go." "Wild horses," he grinned. It was a lady-killer grin and Kitty felt the power of it down to her toes. "You get the idea." She did. Beck was a nice guy. He didn't have to stop to indulge her grandmother. He didn't have to hold Kitty through her panic attack. But he did, and he was. All my years living in Florida and I never rode on an airboat. Oblivious to Kitty's distress, Dotty was in seventh heaven. The driver wore a microphone. He gave them standard safety instructions and then steered the boat clear of the dock. "To our left is Big Al." The driver pointed to a huge gator sunning himself on a mangrove island about 60 feet away. "He likes to check out the boats in case anyone falls in. Don't be the first." "Does he want a snack?" Dottie's voice was picked up in the microphone. "We brought jerky, but I ate it." "And gummies," her young sidekick added. "But I ate those, too." "Big Al prefers something with a bit of meat," the driver said good-naturedly. Now, there are gators throughout the swamp, but there was a crowd of them out in a channel about a mile away. "Let's get there before the other boat." The other airboat had the same idea. They both accelerated. It was a race. Kitty buried her face in Beck's chest and screamed, not that anyone but Beck could hear her above the roar of the engine. He switched to holding her right hand with his right hand and put his left arm around her shoulders. His body heat should have been stifling. Instead, it comforted. "You can go faster," Dotty shouted with troublemaking enthusiasm. That tone of voice was never a good sign. The air left Kitty's lungs. She opened her eyes. The boat leapt forward. Dotty squealed with laughter. "Lady, let go!" The boat swiveled, rocked, and slammed into the airboat they'd been racing with a sickening crunch that sent the top-heavy boat tilting. Screams filled the air, including Kitty's. Beck held onto her and glanced over his shoulder toward Dotty. And then there was a sound Kitty was all too familiar with, the splash of bodies hitting the water. One of them, her grandmother. Chapter 8. "What do you mean we can't go again?" Smelling of eau de swamp, Dotty sounded like a small child. A small child with a large bump on her temple. A small petulant child being strapped into an ambulance gurney. I didn't even get the full ride. Standing in a puddle next to the gurney, Beck tried to let his anger drip off with the smelly swamp water. It was a miracle they hadn't been eaten by Big Al. "Grandma, you rode long enough," Kitty said before Beck could speak. She was soaked, too. "Besides, you captained the boat." "I did, didn't I?" Dottie's faded brown eyes gleamed in triumph. "I even got it full throttle. It's just, her voice dropped to a whisper. Kitty leaned in and reached for Dottie's hand. What? So many people fell into the water. Dottie sounded remorseful, which she should, considering the accident was her fault. She tugged Kitty closer. Are you sure no one got eaten? Not so much as a toe? No one got eaten, Beck said through gritted teeth. Not that the people who fell or jumped into the water hadn't been scared to death of that fate. It was only when they were back on the boat that they'd seen Big Al hadn't moved. We should never have stopped here. Kitty gave Beck a look that seemed to say, really? You want to go there? She drew a deep breath and schooled her features into the soft, helpless look she'd used on the hotel manager the day before, and smiled at the EMT. I'm Dr. Catherine Summer. As you can tell, my grandmother is a bit out of sorts. I'd like to ride with her to the hospital. The EMT had been taking Dottie's blood pressure. He barely glanced up before responding. I'm afraid that's against protocol. I require a chaperone. Dottie sounded like an imperial princess addressing a stormtrooper. Beck knew her well enough now to know she was just as good at manipulating people around her as Kitty was. I've been told I'm irresistible. If I'm alone with you, you might try something. More likely, Dottie would try something. She'd crash the ambulance if someone didn't watch out for her. The young man studied the pair of them and relented, perhaps because he'd heard Dottie had caused the trouble on the boat. If you agree you aren't allowed to treat your grandmother, you can ride along. He rested his metal clipboard on the end of the gurney and signaled his partner it was time to leave. Mrs. Summer, we're going to take you out of the shade. Can you close your eyes or do you need a blindfold? Blindfold? Now I know I need a chaperone, Dottie said thickly, placing her palms over her eyes. Kitty turned to Beck and laid a hand on his chest. One of her eyes is dilated. She's most likely got a concussion. Most likely, given her age, they'll keep her overnight. Her gaze dropped to their feet. They both wore alligator-themed flip-flops provided by the tour company since theirs had been lost in the swamp when they jumped in after Dottie. Thankfully, only Dottie needed medical attention. The park staff was efficient. By the time the boat returned to dock, the ambulance had been here. You should go to Tybee Island without us. Kitty didn't look at Beck when she said it. Beck's instinct told him to stay. Kitty might be a doctor, but they were still hours away from any other family. If he left, they'd be without transportation. If he left, Kitty would be without moral support. She panicked at boats. Who knew what else would rattle her? The longer it takes you to get back to Maggie, the less likely she'll be to forgive you. Kitty withdrew her hand from his chest. You know it's true. She patted her wet board shorts pockets. Oh, I almost forgot. I found this on your floorboard this morning. She handed him his horseshoe good luck charm. The small bit of metal was cool in his palm. He'd lost it the day of the wedding. Doctor, the EMT called to Kitty. Dottie and the gurney were inside the ambulance. It's time to go. Kitty walked sideways, keeping Beck in her sights. Call Maggie. Tell her what happened. Tell her you risked being eaten by an alligator to save Dottie. And tell her, suddenly, Kitty looked like she might cry. Tell her you love her. She spun away, dripping all the way to the ambulance. Had Kitty just given Beck her blessing? Beck clenched the horseshoe in his palm, unable to move. He watched the ambulance pull away, imagining Dottie being upset when they didn't turn on the lights and sirens. Dottie liked anything she experienced to be full service. But thoughts of Dottie couldn't keep his mind off Kitty. She may have been frightened on the boat, but that hadn't kept her from jumping in the water when her grandmother was in danger. And she'd stayed in the smelly water with Beck until they'd helped the other passengers back into the safety of the boat. Such a fierce protector. He hadn't lied when he'd agreed that she was hard to hate. These are for your family. The boat driver had changed out of his wet things, having jumped in the water as well. He handed Beck a stack of dry clothes, which included gray gator. Gator! Gator! T-shirts with a picture of Big Al on the front, jaws wide and ready to chomp. Beck accepted them, holding them away from his wet body. Kitty would appreciate a dry change of clothes. My manager wanted me to remind you that you signed a release form before boarding our vessel. The boat driver looked uncomfortable. The police will be investigating and we'll be cooperating. We hope you do the same. Dottie's not going to sue you for her mistake. That wasn't how she rolled. Beck walked toward the restrooms. She was ready to take another ride. The boat driver paled beneath his tan. God, help us. A few minutes later, Beck was driving toward the hospital and calling Maggie. She hadn't changed her voicemail message. It still said she didn't want to talk to or see him ever again. He should have called her last night. Or this morning. He hadn't, because he hadn't known what to say. And that had made him snap at everything and everyone. He liked clear paths and detailed plans. He stared at the horseshoe charm on his key fob. It had been his grandfather's. Nothing was clear anymore. When Maggie's voicemail beeped at him to start talking, Beck did. Maggie, the L word stuck in his throat. Did he have a right to use it? We had an accident. Well, 2 accidents. One last night and one today. Being Dotty-induced mishaps, they didn't qualify as accidents in the strictest sense of the word. But he wanted Maggie to know he wasn't hiding from what had happened in Boca. We're all okay, but your grandmother needs to spend the night in the hospital. She might have a concussion, and I can't leave them, much as I want to see you. I hope you understand. He choked on making a declaration. I hope to see you tomorrow. Beck hung up. It was telling that he was driving to be with Kitty, not Maggie. But telling of what? That the so-called omens of bad luck he'd noticed on his wedding day meant he didn't love Maggie enough to marry her, even if she forgave him? That he agreed with Kitty about the depth of love Maggie deserved and he could give? That he'd save Kitty first in a barn fire over his prize racehorse. Maggie, he corrected himself. He'd save Maggie first. A bitter taste rose in the back of his throat. But he kept driving toward Kitty, swallowing back truths he didn't want to acknowledge. It took nearly 30 minutes to get to the Chapter 9. I can't believe Grandma didn't want me to spend the night with her at the hospital. Kitty couldn't keep nerves from cracking her voice. Something had happened to Beck between the time she'd left him at the Gator place and the time he'd shown up at the hospital. He was treating her differently. Not like an adversary. She was afraid that meant he decided not to ask for Maggie's forgiveness. She was afraid her actions had taken away a choice better left to Maggie. She was afraid she'd never see Beck again. She shivered, despite the heat, and stared at her untouched salad. They sat at a small table on an outdoor patio at their hotel. It was a little after 9. Their hotel wasn't very popular and they almost had the patio to themselves. A family of 4 sat at a table near the fountain. Your grandmother thinks company means she has to talk. Beck wasn't doing his food any justice either. She'll get more rest if she's alone. I know. I just worry about her. Given the opportunity, Dotty would walk the halls and try to make friends, unconcerned that the back of her gown wasn't tied. It strikes me, Beck said carefully, pushing broccoli across his plate. That had your roles been reversed, yours and Maggie's, you would have taken my calls. Kitty's fork fell to her plate. She's hurt. Beck placed his utensils on his plate with barely a sound. I don't make her happy. You don't know that. I do. He tapped his chest. I feel it here. Things haven't felt right between us for a long time. She came out to the stables a month ago wearing a pink polo shirt and work boots that weren't black. Kitty put her hands on the table. Don't make this decision without Maggie. You've had a couple of frustrating days. He clasped her fingers, holding tight when she would have pulled away. I've had a cool down period. I've had my assumptions about love broken down to their bare bones, picked clean, and exposed to the elements. He edged his chair closer to hers, leaned closer to her, came close enough she could almost feel the essence of his pain. If I loved Maggie, if I loved her deep down to the core of my being, I would have bought a plane ticket or rented a car yesterday. I would have driven all night and stood out in a thunderstorm for her. You did run out in a thunderstorm. At the airport. And then I gave up. Pain threaded his voice like a sharp needle with barbed thread. I took my foot off the accelerator. I wouldn't go that far. Kitty tried for levity. You've driven like a bat out of hell. You were right all along. His gaze pinned hers and tried to convey a message she couldn't decipher. I love Maggie, and I always will, but I don't love her the way I should or the way she deserves. And I'm no good for her. When we're together, she's not herself. What brought on this revelation? She spoke the question so softly, she almost didn't hear it herself. I had second thoughts leading up to the wedding. I told myself it was because the ceremony was such a big production. Beck's gaze dropped to their hands. He stroked a thumb over the back of hers. But last night, when I was griping about you ruining my life. Which I kind of did, she allowed. You told me you'd ruined everything except my heart. He lifted his gaze. It was heavy with remorse and that indecipherable something. My heart wasn't broken when Maggie left me. But when you left me today, I felt hollow inside. No. Everything Kitty believed about sisterly love and loyalty slammed into her chest. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to be like this. And she sure as sugar shouldn't be opening her mouth and asking, why? He didn't say anything for a moment. And in that moment, Kitty felt redemption. If he couldn't say it to Maggie's voicemail, he couldn't possibly say it to Kitty's face. I'm falling in love with you. Oh, he said it all right. And it wasn't in a furtive whisper in case someone was listening. I said, he raised his voice when she sat as still and tense as a mature child awaiting a booster shot. I'm falling in love with you. The world spun, but not enough for Kitty to faint and Beck to disappear, not enough for the gut-wrenching pain from her betrayal of Maggie's trust to ease, or the foolish beat of her heart to calm. What was she going to do? Kitty tugged her hand free. You can't be. I can. And there it was. The look in his eyes that she hadn't been able to read before. It was love. For her. The world spun faster than the blades on the airboat engine. And still, Kitty didn't pass out. You can't do this to me. Kitty struggled to stand, struggled to hold in the cold well of sorrow and reject the warm rays of joy. She's my sister. She stumbled in her two big L flip-flops. Beck stood, reaching out to steady her, and she pushed him away. Her chair fell over and her pink cloth napkin fluttered to the ground. The well-behaved family of four eating pizza by the patio fountain turned to stare. You haven't said you don't have feelings for me. There was his heart right there in his words, on his sleeve, in his eyes. He didn't realize she couldn't give him her heart in return. Not ever. He'd been Maggie's. When Kitty didn't answer, Beck took a step toward her. "Why were you near tears when we said goodbye earlier?" "Because," Kitty choked, horrified. Where was her composed bedside manner? She'd sat with women who knew they were going to deliver a stillborn child without so much as a sob of grief. She'd performed emergency C-sections and held it together. And now? Their waiter hurried out, righted the chair, took one look at them and hurried back inside. Beck brushed the backs of his fingers across Kitty's cheek. That touch promised there was more between them than a spark ignited by an unexpected kiss. It promised winter nights at home in front of the fire and gentle laughter around the dinner table. It promised to be there with coffee when she was called to the hospital in the middle of the night and have breakfast ready when she returned in the morning. Longing welled up inside of her, rising from her chest, squeezing up her throat, stinging her nose and watering her eyes. Everything had seemed so straightforward yesterday. Kiss the groom. Save Maggie. "Kitty," he said softly. "We could have been eaten by Big Al today. Your life must have flashed before your eyes. You must have noticed there was something missing." It hadn't flashed before her eyes. It had struck her in the chest. In her heart. At the worst time after he jumped into the alligator-infested water at the same time she did. She'd realized that Beck was more than good enough for her sister. The feeling that he was more than good enough for Kitty had come later. And now, staring into blue eyes that seemed to shine only for her, she wanted to kiss the groom again. She wanted to forget Maggie. She wanted to do something just for herself. "Kiss me," she demanded in a whisper. "Kiss me goodbye." With a groan, he gathered her close. "I can't kiss you. Technically, I'm still Maggie's." Kitty clung to him. He'd known the moment he cheated on Maggie he'd be just as loathsome to Kitty as her father was. He nestled his cheek to hers. "You won't regret loving me, Kitty." He was wrong. She already did. Chapter 10. Kitty had walked away. The look on her face, that was a bad sign. One that tied his gut in a backwards buckaroo knot. And he'd let her go. He had no right to kiss her, no right to tell her his feelings, not when he was still entangled with Maggie. But he'd been unable to hold his feelings inside. And there was that moment after he'd told her, after the shock of what he'd said wore off, when he could see longing in her deep brown eyes. Beck knew his place in Kitty's world. Her sisters came first. And so, he didn't press her. He didn't talk about his declaration or what the future might bring. They met up at the agreed time in the morning and drove to the hospital without speaking. They broke Dotty out of the hospital around lunchtime and headed toward Atlanta, with Dotty filling in the conversational gap. "I want to do so many things with you too when we got to Atlanta. High tea at Astor Court. The botanical gardens. They are lovely this time of year. And the heat is bearable as long as you get there early. Oh, and we have to eat at the Hungry Peach." Dotty had a long list of mustos. "They have a peach cobbler cupcake that's to die for. We aren't going to stay in town." Kitty sounded reluctant to put an end to her grandmother's wish list. "Beck needs to talk to Maggie." "But you'll come back afterward," Dotty insisted. "No," Kitty said gently. "Once I get my cell phone and purse back, I'm returning to New York." Dotty sked. "You should never go anywhere without your purse." Kitty made a noncommittal noise. "By the way," Dotty said, glancing around the truck. "Where is my purse?" "This is it." Kitty pointed to a gated driveway on Tybee Island, proud of the fact her hand didn't shake. That didn't mean her heart wasn't trying to chisel away out of her chest. There was so much she wanted to say to Beck, so much she wanted to know about him. And the details about how he'd met her father, who'd introduced him to Maggie. But any relationship with him, even if Maggie dumped him, was out of the question. The large, two-story colonial was set back from the road behind dense trees and shrubbery. Further down the road was the Robertson enclave. Thankfully, it wasn't July. Most likely, the only people inside the summer house would be Summers. They'd left Dotty with Great-Aunt Rebecca in Atlanta and driven to Tybee Island in silence. Kitty had plenty of time to come up with a strategy. That didn't mean she had any idea what awaited them. Kitty rattled off a code that Beck entered into the keypad and the gate swung open. "They didn't lock us out," Kitty said, unable to contain her relief. Beck stopped the truck inside the gate. "You don't have to come inside. I'll talk to Maggie alone." It was dark, but the dashboard illuminated the determined set to his jaw. "Not happening." Kitty met his gaze for the first time that day. "I'll go in first. You wait in the truck for 15 minutes, then go around the house and to the boat dock. I'll have Maggie meet you there. I'm not going to hide from your family." Whatever soft words he'd spoken to her last night had stayed at the hotel in Florida. Jilted at the altar, Beck was back. "I'm not worried about what my family will say to you. I'm worried that Maggie will have to listen to it." After a moment, he nodded and drove to the house. 15 minutes. Kitty pushed the passenger door open when he'd parked. She drew a breath past the stabbing pain in her heart and said the words she should have said last night. "I want you to think about the commitment you made to her. People have doubts in relationships all the time, but they reassess and they move forward, stronger than before." "What are you saying?" His question had an edge. "That I can't let you love me, Beck." Her chest contracted, making it hard to draw enough breath to finish this. "That whatever you think you saw in me is just a reflection of the kind, beautiful person my sister is. And that those feelings you think you have for me? They're really for Maggie." She blinked back tears, hoping he couldn't see them in the dark. "Maybe you won't love each other with the passion that sweeps two people off their feet, but you can be good together. Kitty. You promised to marry her, Beck." Kitty made to swing the door shut. "I'm not a candy bar someone called dibs on." Beck had more steel in his voice than patience with Harrington rods in their spines. "For the love of Mike, Kitty. Why do you always have to put yourself second? Ask yourself what your grandfather would do." Kitty took a half step back. "Think really hard about that over the next 15 minutes. She slammed the door. It sounded like he pounded the dashboard. "Good. Mission accomplished." Beck was angry with her. Kitty pushed through the door to the house. It opened on silent hinges to white pine floors and a white paneled hallway. The soft blue and sand colors were meant to soothe. They had no effect on Kitty. "Oh, honey." Kitty's mother must have heard the car door slam. Her brown hair was in a limp bob. She wore white leggings and a white cable knit sweater that reached mid-thigh. She hurried to hug her daughter. "We were so worried about you. How is Mama Summer?" "She's with Great-Aunt Rebecca and under concussion watch for another few days." Although Kitty suspected she'd be fine. "You aren't mad at me." "I could never be mad at one of my girls." Her smile was dreamy and her eyes dilated. Mr. Anti-Anxiety had come to call. The fallen daughter returns. Tim Summer leaned against the doorframe to his study and stared at Kitty before taking a sip of red wine. "I'm almost glad you ruined your sister's life." Mom drifted to the living room across the hall. For once, Kitty was glad her mother had no fight in her. Kitty had enough fight for 2 people. It raced around her veins and put barbs in her demand. When did you offer Beck the horse? What does it matter? He won't get it now. Dad retreated to his office and sat behind a massive walnut desk. Kitty followed him inside and gripped the back of a leather chair. Did you dangle it in front of him as a way to get him to date Maggie? It had occurred to her on the drive up today that Maggie would never have met Beck on her own. Maggie was still in veterinary school. Kitty hadn't wanted to challenge Beck on this point. But Dad? Oh, yeah. On his blotter, his cell phone lit up with a photo. A redhead with pouty lips who didn't look to be older than Kitty. Her father paused to look at the screen before raising his smiling face back to her. They made sense, you know. A horse breeder and a vet. He rested his thumb and forefinger on the phone. Hurt threatened to take over. Make her shout. Make her take his cell phone and fling it across the room. His women were his toys. She wouldn't let his daughters be his toys. They made sense like you and Mom made sense? A pretty accountant and a billionaire? He made it known he was looking for an investor and a mare. Her father sat back in his chair, but not far enough that he couldn't see his phone display if it lit up again. I invited him to a party. You have to admit, for a while there Maggie was really turning out to be normal. Maggie, Kitty choked on her sister's name. Why can't you love us for who we are? He narrowed his eyes and downed the rest of his wine. It used to gall me that our friends thought you were perfect. I never had to bail you out of jail. I never had to forbid you from seeing the wrong sort of boy. You never needed me. Mom needed you, she said softly. She still does. He waved a hand. I'm a businessman. I don't deal in lost causes. I'm assuming you got rid of the horseman? No. There was shock in his brown eyes, so like her own and yet, so different. Why not? Because Maggie deserves the best. Kitty left him to his cell phone. She found Maggie standing on the back porch. There was a red streak in her brown hair. She wore army boots, black leggings, and a zebra-striped blouse. The real Maggie was back. You're a day late. And mad at Kitty if her tone was any indication. The threat of tears and the smell of the ocean filled Kitty's nose. Grandma Dotty, she didn't want to blame every delay on her grandmother. Beck tried to catch you at the airport and there was a fender bender with a shuttle bus. And then yesterday Grandma bumped her head. He tried to get here as soon as he could. Maggie's gaze was cool and assessing. You kissed my fiancé. He's a good man, Maggie. But Kitty couldn't look at her sister when she said it. Instead, she stared out at the dark horizon and the ocean. He was only marrying me for a horse. There was bravado in her tone. I'm pretty sure that was part of Beck's decision process. Kitty wasn't going to deny it. But he loves you. Maggie hugged a porch post, half the defiant Maggie of old, half the fragile woman whose wedding had been ruined. I know you have doubts, Kitty said evenly, thinking about job prospects in Alaska. You didn't want to admit them before the wedding. But I'm here to tell you, if you're not sure, it's okay. And if you're ready to settle down, he's a great guy. So you keep saying. Maggie twirled a lock of red hair and continued to scrutinize Kitty. Kitty sighed and sat in a white rocker, not daring to remember the look of love in Beck's eyes last night. And yet, you don't believe me. Maybe because he kissed you back. Kitty flinched at the hurt in Maggie's voice. Chalk it up to his nerves. You ruined my wedding. Maggie's face contorted, but in anger, not a battle against tears. Everyone's talking about it. That sounded like Dad, not Maggie. Since when did you care what people think? Maggie looked away. I ruined a wedding, Maggie, Kitty said softly. Not your wedding. That dress, that church, I bet your pictures even look like Mom and Dad's wedding. What were you thinking? They do, Maggie said miserably. She came to sit in the rocker next to Kitty's. What happened to the Maggie Summer who wore army boots beneath her debutante gown? Kitty took her hand and squeezed. What happened to the Maggie Summer who couldn't stand country club stiffs? You left me. Maggie's chin went up. You all did. And Dad, we argued. And afterward, I overheard him tell Mom that he wished I was more like you. She sagged in the rocker. So I thought I'd give him what he wanted. And just like that, I landed a normal, decent guy and became Dad's favorite daughter. What do you want to do? Kitty tried to keep her voice neutral and supportive. When her sister remained silent, she urged, take him back. He'll love you in a cotton dress or camo sweats. Or Kitty would crucify him. Maggie gripped the arms of the rocker. He's waiting out by the driveway. He's going to meet you on the dock so you can talk in private. Kitty got to her feet and opened her arms. Come here. Maggie stood, accepting her hug, but didn't hug her back. You're leaving? You don't need the woman who ruined a wedding hanging around the house. Kitty tugged on her Big Al t-shirt. As soon as I get Grandma's purse and my things, I'm out of here. She didn't miss the look of relief in Maggie's eyes. There were extra cars in the garage. I can backtrack to Atlanta and spend the night at Great Aunt Rebecca's with Grandma. You really think I should take him back? Kitty's heart panged a protest. But she was true to herself. She couldn't deny her little sister anything. I think you should do what your heart says is right. Kitty turned to go, and then hesitated at the door. She looked back at her sister. Just, don't hurt him. A figure was huddled at the end of the dock. For a moment, Beck thought it was Kitty. His heart eased. Maggie didn't want him. He'd convince Kitty they had a future together. He'd tell her he'd take it slow. Beck hurried forward, only to stop when the figure turned and a face came into focus, Maggie's. His soles flattened on the dock. I'm sorry. Maggie still wanted him. His breath caught in his throat. He was going to have to do the right thing. Kitty would expect no less. His fiancée stomped to her feet in clunky boots and crossed her arms over her chest. Her eyes were heavily lined and there was a mutinous set to her mouth. She looked nothing like the sweet young woman he'd asked to marry him. Honor raged against love. He had to stand and hear her out. Kitty was right. He had to stand by his commitment. But simultaneously, he wondered if Kitty was near. If she was listening. If her chest felt as hollow as his. Maggie marched toward him. Do you remember the day we met? He nodded, bracing himself for whatever Maggie was going to dish out. She stopped a few feet away, so familiar, yet so different in both appearance and attitude to the woman he'd been engaged to these past few months. My dad was hosting a big house party. He'd invited all kinds of single men. Most of them were like Dad. Corporate suits, interested in making the right connections and the right impressions. But not you. Beck cleared his throat. To be honest, I was there to buy that filly. And Dad conveniently spotted an opportunity. Maggie waved his comment aside. I knew you were different. You smelled like hay, not expensive cologne. You listened when people spoke to you, without checking your phone or scoping out the room to find someone better to network with. We talked on the porch stairs for hours. He'd been relieved, because talking to Maggie took the pressure off trying to ask people for money. You were nice. And you thought I fit in. Her hands speared through her hair. Was that a glint of red? I haven't been honest with you. Defiance leaked from her voice, and then disappeared altogether. Do you know why it always takes me so long to get dressed? He shook his head, feeling the pitch of the waves rock the dock beneath his feet. Because I can't stand the clothes you seem to like. I try stuff on. I take it off. I try something else. I mean, you're not you when you're with me. No, she sounded as relieved as he felt. I was trying to be Kitty. Who Beck was now convinced he loved with an intensity as deep and sudden as a Florida thunderstorm. You don't want to marry me, Beck said, trying to sound as if he wasn't about to drop to his knees and thank her. She shook her head, stepping closer. Are you heartbroken? It would be impolite to say no. He tried to wear his poker face, not wanting to hurt her. She wrapped her arms around his neck in a gentle hug, and laid her head on his shoulder. I know I shouldn't say this. I know I might regret it someday, but... Kitty hadn't slept a wink on Great Aunt Rebecca's chin sofa. Between a broken heart, the overly happy birds and cicadas, she'd been up since a rooster should have been crowing. There was a knock on the front door. It wasn't even 5 a.m. Kitty padded to the door in a tank top and blue-checked boxers. It felt good to wear her own clothes again. She turned on the foyer light and opened the door, not worrying about crime since Great Aunt Rebecca had a condo in a gated retirement community. A man lurked in the shadows just outside of the porch light. Kitty's heart banged into overdrive before the man stepped into the light. Beck? What are you doing here? She didn't give him a chance to answer. Oh, for heaven's sake. Did you ruin things with Maggie? If you dumped her, I never want to see you again. Despite the strongest urge to wrap her arms around him. No, he stood in the doorway, staring at her the way he had in the restaurant hotel that last night together, as if he couldn't live without her. She dumped me. You were honest with her, weren't you? Kitty tossed her arms and circled back to the living room, turning on lights as she passed. Why did you have to tell her anything? You know you'll forget me once you get back to the rhythm of your life. That thought had torn her apart all night. Kitty. No. I can't talk to you until I've had coffee. And a shower. Or maybe after a shower while she had coffee. I need to figure this out. Where's Maggie? Kitty. Beck hooked her arm and gently guided her to a seat on the couch on the blanket. Maggie doesn't want to see you. Oh. Kitty thought she might cry. Or anyone else in the family. He smoothed back her hair. I dropped her off at the airport. But, Kitty's voice was small. Was she angry? Was she crying? Was it because of me? His arms came around her tenderly. After too long pretending to be someone she wasn't, Maggie was relieved. She loves me about as much as I love her. She just wants time to find herself. Where? She didn't want anyone to know. Kitty tried to shift out of Beck's arms, because she still couldn't be with him. It would hurt Maggie. Thank you for telling me. What is your prom date doing here so early in the morning? Dotty appeared in the doorway. She wore a pink silk kimono. Had a bad case of bedhead and a pillow crease in her cheek. He's trying to profess his deep love and undying affection to Kitty. Beck's smile was as sweet as a newborn's face. if she'll let me get a word in edgewise. For once, Kitty had no words. That seems inappropriate. Dotty dropped into a chair. Given you're in high school. How many dates have you been on? 3, he said without hesitation. And I'm here to take her to breakfast, which would be date number 4. Hey. Dotty sat up taller. Beck, get out. Kitty could barely get the words past her thick throat. She pushed him away. I can't do this to Maggie. Beck didn't budge. Do you know what Maggie said to me after she dumped me? Kitty cringed. I don't want to know, do I? Was it painful? Could Maggie find it in her heart to forgive her? Beck brushed the backs of his fingers over her cheek. She said, don't hurt her. Don't, almost the same words Kitty had said to Maggie when she left her. She didn't dare breathe or look at Beck or believe it. She gave us her blessing? Beck nodded. But she said she needs time away from you, from me, from everyone. But mostly me. Kitty struggled for air. I let her down. He shook his head. You saved her from an imperfect marriage. But it still hurts. She nodded. He stroked her cheek. Give it time. Okay. Kitty drew a deep breath. She should have felt better. She should have felt as if she was blossoming like a rose beneath his gaze. But she didn't, because there was Maggie to be considered and there was the fact she'd never been in love before. There were too many pitfalls. Too many places for her to screw this up. Or Beck. Don't even think I'd ever stray, Beck said, reading her mind. What I feel for you won't let me look at another woman. In those 15 minutes you gave me to think, I decided I'd listen to whatever Maggie had to say, but I'd have to tell her I couldn't marry her. I'd have to tell her I didn't love her the way she deserved to be loved. I may be a good man, but I'm not the man that could make her happy. I should warn you, Dotty said, interrupted Beck's beautiful speech. That the summer girls are a handful. Your affection might be tested. Kitty rolled her eyes, feeling the tension ebb, feeling confidence in her and Beck and what they could be together fill up the broken, hollow places inside of her. Thunderstorms, fender benders, gator close calls. This summer girl has already been challenging. Beck stood, claimed Kitty's hands, and brought her to her feet. I didn't follow my intuition with Maggie. Correction, he tapped his chest. I didn't follow my heart. I viewed her with a logical lens. Checks and balances. Pluses and minuses. Men, Dotty huffed. Kitty was content to let him continue. But with you, every breath, every heartbeat, every instinct I have is telling me to be with you. He raised her hand and kissed the back of it. We can take it slow. We can go at a traditional pace. Dates. Meeting the parents. He tilted his head from side to side. Re-meeting the parents. But I know for certain I want you in my life. If we don't mess this up, this could be the deep kind of love your grandparents had. Just tell me. Kitty was done listening. She tugged his lips to hers and kissed him. And this time, he passed the kissing test. Epilogue. There's something to be said for a wealthy husband. Grandma Dotty hooked her arm through Aubrey's. But there's also something to be said for husbands who have a talent for kissing. We're going to Layla's wedding. We're not going fishing for a groom. Aubrey rued the fact that she'd become the responsible daughter since Kitty had a falling out with Dad. And Maggie. And several hundred wedding guests. She'd taken her grandmother to 4 weddings and a funeral this year. It was like wading into social waters with her own personal matchmaker. I'm too busy for a man. That wasn't quite true. She had her sights set on one man, Marcos Alfaro, one of Ecuador's wealthiest men. He was trying to steal, her research. As far as Aubrey was concerned, Marcos Alfaro was public enemy number 1. And he was rumored to be among Layla's wedding guests. Aubrey was taking Grandma Dotty to the wedding in Ecuador. And while she was there, she was going to put Marcos Alfaro in his place. Read Aubrey's story in. And then he kissed me.